Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still remember the damp chill of that evening in Pine Valley, like it's burned into my mind. I was called in by some higher-ups to check out the odd disappearances near the local hiking trail. Honestly, I'm used to handling bizarre stuff. That's sort of my whole deal. But something about this place felt different from the minute I stepped foot there. When I arrived, a local police officer was waiting for me. He looked skeptical, like he'd rather be anywhere else, but he was polite enough. I tried not to judge him. Most people in his line of work think what I do is just guesswork or superstition. That changed once we headed into the woods. From the start, the forest had this heavy silence that made my ears ring. It's that kind of hush that feels unnatural, like the sounds around you have been swallowed by something lurking in the darkness. As we moved deeper, it got harder to see, and the temperature dropped fast. There was a thin layer of fog clinging to the bases of the trees. Every now and then it would swirl up around our ankles, then vanish just as quickly. I tried shining my flashlight around, but the shadows seemed to push back. And the strangest part was that I kept having the sense that something was watching from just behind the tree line, like I'd catch a dark shape in my peripheral vision, turn to look, and there'd be nothing there. The officer cleared his throat a few times, probably to break the tension. He kept calling out, "Anyone out here? Hello?" But his voice just echoed, fading without a response. We knew this place had been the scene of multiple disappearances, yet we saw no sign of life. No hikers, no campers, nothing. It was like the entire forest had emptied itself of people. We pushed forward along the main trail, occasionally checking side paths for footprints or broken twigs. The ground was soft from recent rain, so it was easy to spot even small disturbances. But what we found instead were these little bits of bone fragments, tiny pieces scattered in a messy cluster off to the side of the trail. They weren't big enough to be from a large animal, and they looked picked clean. The officer grew quiet. He shone his flashlight on them, and I could see the color drain from his face. I've seen remains before, but there was something off about how they were arranged, like they'd been left as a warning. A sudden gust of wind made the trees groan, and I swear I heard a faint voice calling my name, or maybe it was just my imagination. Either way, it sent a spike of ice right down my spine. I tried to keep calm and remember the techniques I've learned over the years. This wasn't the first time I'd encountered something that could mimic voices. I told the officer, in a low voice, that we needed to stay focused, and that if he heard anything that sounded like someone he knew, he shouldn't rush off blindly. He nodded, but his eyes were darting around. Then we heard it again. This time, it sounded exactly like a woman's voice calling for help, just a few steps ahead. "Is anyone there?" the officer shouted, his flashlight trembling in his grip. But there was no reply, just another wave of silence. It was unnerving how the forest seemed to devour every echo. I led us off the main path, carefully moving toward where I thought I heard the voice. That's when the fog thickened. It wasn't normal fog, it was dark, almost oily in how it clung to the bushes and branches. My flashlight's beam cut through it only slightly, leaving everything murky. The officer's breathing grew ragged. He kept muttering, "This is insane, this is insane," under his breath. I tried to reassure him, but I was fighting off my own terror too. The deeper we walked, the more I felt a pressure around my chest, like the air was heavier than it should be. It was similar to that feeling you get when you know you're being watched by something that has no business existing in our everyday world. I pulled out a couple of items from my backpack, things I've used in the past on cases where something unexplainable was at play. Let's just say It's a set of tools that help me test the environment for energy changes. I could see the officer's skepticism turning into fear. He didn't ask questions, but I could tell he wanted out of there. Then we heard this low growl from somewhere behind us. It wasn't too loud, but it echoed unnaturally, like there were layers to it. I whipped around with my flashlight, searching through the swirl of fog, expecting to see a bear or some wild animal. But there was nothing, only twisted branches that looked like bony arms in the beam of light. The growl faded, as if it had never been there. At that point, I noticed the forest was dead silent again. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. That total absence of sound was more disturbing than any noise I'd ever heard. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and my heartbeat felt like a drum in my ears. We kept going, even though our instincts screamed at us to turn back. The officer and I found a small clearing where the fog seemed to recede. There, in the middle of that clearing, we discovered footprints leading nowhere, like someone stood in place, then just disappeared. I crouched down to examine them, and they sank deeper into the mud than a normal person's would. It was as if whoever made them had a massive weight or something else going on. Before I could stand back up, the officer yanked on my sleeve, his eyes wide. He pointed to the tree line, where I saw a flicker of movement. It looked like a shadow stepping between the trunks, but it vanished too quickly to make out any shape. We both rushed over, only to find empty space and more of that dense, clinging fog. And that was it. Nothing else. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. That was around the time I sensed, well, I don't really know how to describe it in normal terms. Let's say it felt like the presence of something old and angry. I couldn't tell if it was focused on me or just protective of its territory, but it was definitely aware we were there. The officer started begging to leave. He said he couldn't handle this anymore, that no missing person was worth tracking if it meant dealing with whatever was out there. I knew I had to do something quickly. I told him to stay put for a moment. I won't go into details about what I did. I'd rather not share specifics, but let's just say I've picked up certain methods to address these sorts of phenomena. It took a few minutes, during which I felt waves of unease rolling through me. The forest seemed to pulse with each breath I took. Then, as abruptly as it all started, the heaviness lifted. The fog thinned out. A breeze rustled the branches, and the natural sounds of the woods returned, like someone had flipped a switch. I glanced over at the officer, and he looked pale and shaken, but he was breathing normally again. We both stayed there, listening, half expecting another growl or another voice to echo through the trees. But there was nothing, no more voices, no more weird sounds, just a calm, quiet night, which felt somehow wrong after everything we'd just experienced. Eventually, we made our way back toward the trailhead. We didn't speak much. We both had that dazed look people get when they can't make sense of what they've just seen. Once we reached the entrance, the officer thanked me in a rushed tone, like he was embarrassed to show how rattled he was. He said he'd report that the trail was clear again, but the relief in his voice only proved how terrified he'd been. I told the authorities what I usually say, that the area was safe for now, but they should keep an eye on it. I didn't go into detail about how or why. They've learned not to ask too many questions. After that, I headed out of Pine Valley the same night, feeling a knot in my stomach because, honestly, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods was still lurking. It just decided, for whatever reason, to let us go. To this day, I can't fully explain what happened out there or where those people vanished to. The nightmares still creep in sometimes, mostly the memory of that oily fog and those bones scattered on the ground. All I know is that after I did what I had to do, the disappearances stopped. Pine Valley went back to normal, or at least that's what the locals say. But for me, that place is anything but normal. I still get chills thinking about it, and I have a feeling that sooner or later I'll be called back there, because whatever was hiding in those trees might not stay quiet forever. Story 2. I remember that day so vividly. Every breath I took felt cold and sharp, like the air itself was trying to warn me. It was a late afternoon in early fall, but winter had arrived early that year. The snowfall was unexpected and had blanketed the nearby forest around Westport in a thin, icy layer. My friends and I had talked about coming back to that spot after our weird experience at night a few days prior. There'd been all these rumors swirling among us about what we might have seen that evening: a giant bird, a strange animal, or maybe something else entirely. But we couldn't let the curiosity go, so we all decided to head out there again, only this time while there was still light. I was the first to notice how silent it was as we entered the wooded area. Normally, even with the cold, you might hear the occasional crow or the crunch of small creatures scurrying around. But that day, there was this heavy stillness that instantly put me on edge. The sky was grey, and the snow on the ground reflected just enough light for us to see pretty far between the pines. We were walking single file on a narrow path, each of us stepping in the footprints of the person ahead to avoid sinking too deep into the slush. The chill in the air kept stinging my nose, but it wasn't just the cold bothering me. It was that feeling you get when you know you're not alone. I kept looking around, half expecting to see something dart between the trees. Sometimes I thought I spotted a shape, but then I'd realize it was just the shadow of a branch or a clump of snow falling. Still, every time my heart would pound a bit harder. We reached a small clearing where the light broke through the canopy. The snow was pristine there, without a single footprint, almost like no animal or person had gone near it. One of my friends nudged me and pointed out that usually you'd see deer tracks or signs of other wildlife, but it was completely untouched. That's when I noticed the silence had gotten even more intense. I could hear the blood pumping in my ears. I tried to break the tension by saying something like, "Well, if there's anything out here, it sure knows how to hide." But nobody laughed. We all just kept inching forward, scanning the trees. The wind would pick up every so often, making the highest branches creak, but the forest floor remained oddly still. It felt like everything was holding its breath. As we approached a thicker cluster of pines, I suddenly felt my stomach drop, like the moment on a roller coaster right before a big plunge. There was this huge, dark outline near one of the trunks. My eyes locked on it, and I felt my muscles tense. It had a vaguely human shape, but it was so tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and covered in what looked like shadows. I managed to stammer something to get my friend's attention, but I didn't want to shout. It felt like if I raised my voice, I'd provoke it. Before anyone else could see it, the figure just disappeared behind the tree. I swear, 1 second it was there, and in the next, it was gone. It didn't step away. It didn't move like any normal creature. 1 blink, and it was no longer in sight. One of my friends ran toward the spot, slipping in the snow, but there was nothing behind the trunk. Just empty space and unbroken snow. No footprints, no branches moved aside, no hint that something had been there. I stood there, my breath coming out in short, cloudy gasps, staring at that tree. My friend circled around, checking the surrounding area. It made no sense. We were all pretty shaken. There was no conversation for a minute or two. It was just everyone trying to process what we'd seen, or at least what I'd seen. But I could tell from their expressions that nobody was brushing it off. They'd seen my reaction, and they could feel how wrong the atmosphere was. One of the others suggested we keep moving, so we huddled closer together and walked deeper into the woods. Part of me wanted to run straight back to the car, but I also felt this weird pull, like I needed to understand what was happening. Every so often I thought I heard branches snapping off in the distance, but I couldn't be sure if it was just the wind or that thing following us. We came across a spot where the snow was kind of disturbed, like someone or something had shuffled around there. There were small twigs scattered and some leaves that looked recently overturned. I knelt down and touched one of the broken branches. It was fresh, the wood still bright inside. It couldn't have been more than a few minutes old. All of us looked around, trying to see any sign of footprints or animal tracks, but the weird thing was, there were none. Just broken twigs, and this uneasy feeling that something had rushed through there and vanished. As the afternoon wore on, the daylight started to fade. The sky was that sort of dull grey that doesn't give you a proper sunset, just a gradual dimming. We decided it'd be safer to head back before it got dark. Nobody said it out loud, but I think each of us felt that if this thing was hard to handle in daylight, we definitely didn't want to face it in the dark. On the way back, the silence was even worse. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that at any moment I'd see that figure again, maybe this time rushing straight at us instead of disappearing. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. There was a sense that every tree was hiding something, like the forest had turned into some living, watchful entity that wanted us gone. When we finally saw the edge of the woods and glimpsed the road through the thinning trees, I felt this wave of relief wash over me. It was like breaking free from a suffocating grip. We hurried to the car. Nobody bothered to talk until we were all safely inside, doors locked, engine running. Only then did I let out the breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. On the ride back to the house, we tried to piece things together. Had we all imagined it? Could it be a trick of the light, or some animal we just aren't used to seeing? But the more we talked, the more we realized none of the usual explanations fit. It wasn't shaped like a deer, and it moved too silently to be a bear or a person. And the way it vanished, that was the part that really got under my skin. It wasn't like it ran away. It just wasn't there anymore. Later that night, as we sat in my friend's living room, we tried to look up any local stories or legends about weird sightings in the area. We found fragments of tales, people talking about shadowy figures in the woods, or illusions that mess with hikers. But nothing definitive. It just made my skin crawl to think we'd actually seen something like that with our own eyes. I still can't explain it. Every time I think about that figure, I get this feeling in my gut that I can't shake off. And the strangest part? After that day, none of us ever talked about going back. We just let it go. I think we all silently agreed we didn't want to push our luck. To this day, I have no clue what I saw lurking behind that tree. It was too large and too unnatural for me to feel comfortable chalking it up to some normal animal. Even now, when I close my eyes and remember how quickly it seemed to vanish, I get chills. Maybe there are things out there that we're better off leaving alone. All I know is, I never felt so convinced that I was being watched as I did in that silent forest, and I hope I never feel that way again. Story 3. I still get a chill down my spine just thinking about what happened that night. I was staying with my cousin in Albert, Colorado, back in the fall of 2021. We'd all heard the rumors about some giant winged thing lurking around the forests, but I never took them seriously, at least not until that particular evening, when everything changed for me. It was cold enough that my breath hung in the air, and I remember pulling my hoodie tight while stepping outside onto the porch. The sky was dark and clear, and the moon was full enough to cast faint shadows across the yard. My cousin was inside making coffee, so I was alone for a few minutes, just trying to enjoy the quiet. That's when I heard a sound I still can't fully describe. Like a heavy branch cracking somewhere above me, but with an almost rhythmic pattern, almost like wing beats. At first I thought maybe a big bird was up there, like one of those huge eagles or maybe a turkey vulture. People around town had been insisting the sightings were just big birds, exaggerated by imagination. But as I listened closer, It felt different, louder, deeper, and slightly echoey, like something huge was cutting through the night. My adrenaline spiked, and I found myself slowly stepping off the porch to see if I could spot anything. I saw movement among the treetops near the back fence. I couldn't make out much, just a shifting shadow that felt way larger than any bird I'd ever seen. But the shape seemed wrong, like it had more structure than just wings and a body. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a second I thought I'd imagined it, until I heard that noise again, like something adjusting its weight on a thick branch. The trees rustled, and I swore I saw part of the branch bend under its weight. I took a few steps closer to the fence line, feeling both stupidly curious and scared out of my mind. I tried to angle myself to get a better view under the moonlight. That's when the thing suddenly spread its wings. They were massive. My best guess is that they stretched wider than the length of my cousin's pickup truck. The motion kicked up a gust of wind that made the leaves swirl around me, and I stumbled back, practically gasping. For a moment I locked eyes with whatever it was, or maybe I just imagined I did, but I felt this overwhelming sense of being watched, like it knew I was there. My throat went dry, my gut twisted. I remember telling myself to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like my body froze up, and I was just standing there, staring at this impossible silhouette. Then it took off, launching upward with a powerful flap that sounded like fabric snapping in the wind, only 1,000 times louder. I heard branches crack and snap as it tore through the treetops. I tried to keep my eyes on it, but the trees were dense, and all I caught was a black mass gliding just under the moon. It almost seemed human-like for a fraction of a second, the way its body angled in flight. Before I could even process that, it vanished into the dark sky, leaving me trembling and speechless. When my cousin came out to call me back in, I could barely form words. I just pointed in the direction I'd seen it, my hands shaking. He looked at me like I was nuts, but when he saw how pale I was, he knew I wasn't faking. I babbled something about a creature, enormous wings, not just a bird. He tried to calm me down, saying maybe it was just a big eagle or an owl. But the raw fear I felt told me it was something else entirely. I went back inside the house and tried to pull myself together. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I got this sick feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. It was like my body was telling me something was very, very wrong. I kept replaying the moment it spread its wings, and the sheer size of it. Every time I closed my eyes, that image got burned deeper into my brain. I don't think I slept at all that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, every distant rustle of branches, it all made me jump. The next morning, I went out to check the area where I'd seen it. My cousin came with me this time, though he was still skeptical. We found broken branches about 20 feet up, way thicker than a normal bird could have snapped. It looked like something heavy had indeed been perched there. We also found this large, dark feather stuck in a patch of bark, bigger than my forearm. I picked it up, and my chest started pounding again. This wasn't just from some typical hawk or falcon. It looked far too substantial, the quill thicker than my thumb. My cousin's face went pale when he saw it, and he just muttered, "What the hell?" under his breath. Neither of us knew what to do with that feather. We stood there, feeling completely out of our depth. I ended up taking it inside, but the longer I held onto it, the more uneasy I felt. Part of me wanted to call the sheriff or the wildlife department, but I knew what that would sound like. Plus, from everything I'd heard around town, the sheriff was telling people to stay calm and not buy into the wild rumors. I felt like no one would believe me anyway. For the rest of that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the tree line. Even though I didn't see it again, I caught myself glancing outside every few minutes, expecting to see a huge shape lurking. Every so often I'd hear crows cawing overhead, and I'd jump, half expecting that deep wing beat again. My cousin tried to distract me with games and random conversation, but I was still rattled to my core. He finally admitted he didn't think it was just a regular bird anymore, especially after seeing that feather. By late evening, I found myself on the porch again, but this time I had a flashlight with me. I kept shining it around, half hoping to see something, half hoping I'd see nothing at all. The forest was dead silent, way quieter than normal. No wind, no insect sounds, nothing. And honestly, that was even worse. It felt like the entire area was holding its breath. A few times I thought I heard distant flapping, but it might have been my mind playing tricks. The tension was unreal. Then, around midnight, all that fear and pressure just stopped. The silence went back to normal nighttime chirps and distant rustles. It was like the woods exhaled. I didn't see the creature again, and eventually I forced myself back inside. That indescribable dread I'd been carrying suddenly lifted, and I couldn't explain why. It was as if something had come through, let me see it, and then vanished without a trace. The next day, everything felt bizarrely normal, except for this eerie sense that we had a visitor no one could fully understand. I still don't know what I saw, but I've never forgotten that massive silhouette against the moonlight and the unnatural sound of its wings cutting the air. I've heard plenty of theories, cryptid, mutated bird, or just a trick of the light. None of them feel convincing after standing just a few yards beneath it. My cousin still has that feather tucked away somewhere. Sometimes I think we should get it tested, but a part of me is afraid of what the results might show. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't just a regular bird, and I've never experienced anything like that before or since. Even now, I can't fully explain it. People might say I'm exaggerating or chasing attention, but all I can share is what I felt in that moment, and it was this primal, overwhelming fear mixed with sheer awe. Something huge was out there, at least for one night, and maybe it's still around, hiding among the dark treetops, waiting to take flight when the moon is high. All I know is that I'll never forget the sound of those wings echoing through the cold Colorado sky, and how it all just ended. No final confrontation, no big reveal. It was like it came out of nowhere, scared the hell out of me, and then disappeared, leaving me with more questions than answers. Questions I don't think I'll ever be able to solve. Story 4. I remember that day in 2022 so vividly it still gives me chills. We'd gone out to a remote ranch near Millfield, Colorado, hoping to unplug from everything for a while. It was supposed to be just one day of quiet, fresh air, and maybe a little stargazing at night. But from the moment we arrived in the morning, something about that place felt off. The ranch stood at the end of this dusty road, a good distance away from any neighbors or main highways. On the drive up, I noticed how tall the pine trees were, almost leaning over the road as if they wanted to swallow us whole. Once we parked, I remember stepping out of the car and hearing nothing but the crunch of gravel under my feet. Normally in the countryside, there are birds or some breeze rustling the leaves, but there was barely any sound. I tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe I was just tired from the trip. Throughout the morning, we settled in, unpacked, and started exploring the property. The whole area had a certain weight in the air, like every step we took was being observed. Maybe it was my imagination, but every time I looked over my shoulder, the pine trees seemed darker and denser than they had just a second before. The ranch itself was old but well maintained, and the owner had left a note reminding us to keep an eye out for coyotes. That didn't bother us. We had heard coyotes before on previous trips, and their howls usually felt like part of the natural soundtrack. Around midday, I wandered toward the back of the property, where the forest started getting thicker. My plan was just to stretch my legs and see a bit of the surrounding area, But something stopped me in my tracks after about 20 paces in. I couldn't pinpoint it at first. It wasn't a sound. Rather, it was the complete lack of sound that got my attention. The wind had died. No birds, no insects, absolutely nothing. It was like a vacuum in those trees. My arms prickled, and I remember thinking, this can't be normal. But I also didn't want to run back, looking like I was just spooked over nothing. By the afternoon, the rest of my family was starting to feel uneasy too. We tried to keep busy, cooking a quick lunch and chatting about the plan for the evening. But there was this odd tension, like we were all waiting for something to happen. At one point, I took the trash outside to the designated drop-off spot. It was maybe 50 meters from the main cabin, but as soon as I stepped away from the door, that familiar weight hit me. The distance felt a lot longer than 50 meters. There was this creeping sensation that someone was standing just behind the tree line, quietly watching every move I made. Normally, you'd hear the crunch of leaves or see an animal dart by, but it was just silent and still. When I came back inside, I noticed I had goosebumps running all the way up my arms. I told myself it was just the chill in the air, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. My aunt mentioned she had seen something move between two large pines earlier, but she chalked it up to a deer or some other animal. Still, she admitted that it moved too smoothly, like it was trying not to be seen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we hoped the night sky would bring some comfort. Sometimes seeing the stars can make you feel less isolated. But that night, the stars seemed unable to pierce the darkness around us. We went outside to look, but it was like the sky itself refused to light the ranch. The outlines of the trees looked sharper, almost menacing, as if they were closing in. Then we heard it, soft rustling in the distance, branches snapping like something heavy was forcing its way through. We called out, hoping maybe it was a ranch hand or another guest, but no one answered. The rustling stopped the second we made a sound. My heart started racing. I tried to calm myself with logic. Maybe it was a deer or a puma stalking around. But I couldn't dismiss the feeling that it was something else, something that didn't want to be identified. I mustered up some courage and shone a flashlight into the trees, slowly scanning. For a split second, I thought I saw a shape, taller than any person I know, standing perfectly still behind a trunk. When the beam of light passed over that spot, I swear I caught the glint of eyes staring right back at me. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I nearly dropped the flashlight. My entire body was vibrating with this pure primal fear. No one else saw what I did, but they all felt it. This heavy presence that told us we weren't welcome. We huddled closer together, unsure whether to go back inside or try to confront whatever was there. Eventually the silence returned, but it was even thicker than before. We barely spoke after that. Even inside the cabin we were on edge. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see something pressed up against the glass. But the forest just stood there, dark and unmoving. I could feel it out there, though. I think we all could. I don't know when exactly it ended. At some point the wind started up again, and I heard one single coyote howl in the distance. Strangely enough, that was a relief. It felt normal, like the night was regaining its familiar rhythm. We never got any concrete proof of what was lurking around that ranch. The next morning, we left as planned, and none of us spoke much about it on the drive back. But I'll never forget the feeling that day, like we had ventured into a hidden pocket of the world, where something ancient and unseen was watching us, just waiting for the right moment to make itself known. To this day, I still get a knot in my stomach, thinking about that shape between the trees and those eyes reflecting my flashlight. It was a beautiful place, no doubt, but sometimes I wonder what else lives in those forests near Millfield, hidden from everyone until it decides otherwise. And I have no explanation for why everything went so silent, or why that presence suddenly vanished as quickly as it appeared. It just did. And I'm still left with the memory, the chills, and no solid answers. Story 5. I remember that day so vividly, it still sends chills down my spine. It was the summer of 2021, and my friend Alex and I drove out to the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania for a weekend camping trip. We wanted absolute quiet, away from the usual crowds and near a creek we'd found on an old map. We thought we knew the area pretty well, but we ended up choosing a spot that felt a little too remote, like we'd stepped into another world once we left the main trail. By late afternoon, we'd set up our tents among these towering pine trees, thick underbrush, and a shallow creek just a short walk away. It was the kind of place where, for a moment, you almost forget you have a life back in the city. We lit a small fire as the sun set and sat around it, eating some quick meals from our packs. The air was fresh, a slight breeze rustling the pine needles. It felt peaceful, like that stillness you only find out in the deep woods. We ended up staying up pretty late. The night sky was so clear we could see more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. I felt this comforting hush settle over the trees as we talked about everything and nothing. Sometime close to midnight, we finally decided to turn in, each of us crawling into our separate tents. I don't know how long I actually slept, but around 2 in the morning, I shot awake to this massive, thunderous crash, like a giant tree trunk snapping in half and slamming to the ground. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Alex unzipped his tent first, and I heard him murmur some curse under his breath. I fumbled with my own zipper and grabbed my flashlight. The second I stepped outside, I realized how eerily silent everything was. The wind had died, the crickets had stopped, and it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. We stood there, shining our flashlights into the darkness, calling out softly to see if there was any movement or if a tree had actually fallen. But we saw nothing. No broken branches, no fresh debris, nothing that could explain that massive thud. We decided to walk a few yards around the campsite, just to make sure nothing dangerous was close by. It was still quiet, but there was this weird heaviness in the air. Then Alex froze, aimed his flashlight between 2 thick pine trunks, and whispered that he saw something move. I darted my light in the same direction, but I only saw shadows. I tried telling him maybe it was a deer or something harmless, but I felt this rush of dread I couldn't shake. It was so dark, and the trees felt like they were closing in on us. We hung around for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, too scared to wander too far. My legs were actually shaking as we stood there, deciding if we should check beyond the trees or get back to our tents. But the longer we stayed, the more exposed I felt, like something was watching us from every angle. We finally agreed to just go back, zip ourselves in, and pray for morning to come. I lay there, fully awake, listening to every tiny sound. The forest started making noises again. An owl hooted in the distance, leaves rustled, but it didn't calm me down. Every time a twig snapped, my body tensed. I probably dozed off at some point, but I can't say I got much real sleep. At first light, I was out of my tent, stretching and trying to figure out what happened the night before. Alex was already poking at the embers of our fire, his face pale. We talked it through, trying to convince ourselves it was just a big branch or a small rock slide somewhere. Neither of us said we believed it, but it was better than facing how terrified we both were. After a quick breakfast, we walked down to the creek to refill our water bottles and maybe shake off the tension. It was kind of relaxing at first. The creek was flowing gently, sunlight flickering on the surface. We followed it for a bit, stepping on smooth stones, just taking in the scenery. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this distant rhythmic sound, like a series of low drum beats. At first, I thought maybe it was thunder, but the sky was perfectly clear. Alex heard it too, and we both just stopped to listen. It faded out pretty quickly, so we thought maybe there were other campers or a group having some kind of party. But we didn't see any signs of tents or smoke, and the sound came and went so fast it almost felt imaginary. We ended up hiking around the area, searching for any sign of people. Nothing. No footprints, no campground, no voices. The only noise we heard was the creak and our own footsteps. Eventually, we made our way back to camp, not entirely sure if we'd both just hallucinated those drum-like sounds. We decided to stay one more night, though we were both on edge. The day passed without any big incidents, but that uneasy feeling never left me. It was like the forest itself had eyes. When night fell, we tried to keep ourselves distracted. We made a fire again, but neither of us was talking much. Around 8 or 9 at night, I heard the drumming again, this time clearer and more frequent. It had a steady rhythm, like someone was practicing on a single drum somewhere in the trees. It was so unsettling because I couldn't tell how far away it was. 1 minute it seemed close, the next it was echoing off in the distance. Alex muttered something about it maybe being echoes off the creek, water hitting hollow rocks or logs. But his eyes told me he didn't fully believe that. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was that same sensation you get when you realize you're not alone in a room. Except we were in the middle of a forest with no one else around, at least no one we could see. The wind picked up a bit, making the tops of the pines sway, and every time the wind died down, those drum beats seemed to creep back in. It was hypnotic and terrifying at the same time. We stayed up until we couldn't keep our eyes open, waiting for something else to happen. But aside from the faint drumming, the night was strangely calm. My stomach was in knots, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were completely surrounded by something we couldn't understand. We crawled into our tents eventually, but it's not like I felt any safer there. I just lay awake, my heart pounding, wondering if I'd regret not packing up and leaving immediately. Somehow, I fell asleep. When I woke up at dawn, the drumming was gone. No crashes, no weird echoes, just the usual morning sounds of the woods. It was like the forest had returned to normal overnight, and I almost questioned whether we'd imagined the whole thing. Alex looked as exhausted as I felt, and we agreed we'd had enough. We broke down camp in record time, never speaking much, just wanting to get out of there. To this day, I can't explain what we heard or saw. There were no clear footprints or broken branches, and the drum beats seemed to come from every direction and no direction at all. We didn't see any people, and we still have no solid theory. It just happened, and then it stopped, like some part of that forest was playing tricks on us. Thinking about it still makes my skin crawl, and I haven't been back to that part of the Allegheny National Forest since. I doubt I ever will. Even now, whenever I close my eyes and think about that night, I can almost hear that eerie rhythm echoing through the trees, and it makes me wonder what else might be out there in the quiet places we think we know so well. Story 6. I still can't shake off what happened that night. I'd been dealing with coyotes around my property in Green Hollow, New Hampshire, so I set up my thermal scope and night vision gear, convinced I was prepared for anything. I've hunted for years and never had any real scares, just typical wildlife noises. But this was different. It started off like any other night. Cold air, complete silence, except for the rustling of leaves under my boots. I remember being surprised at how still it was. No distant howls, no birds, nothing. Around midnight, I noticed something hovering near the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. It was a red sphere, roughly the size of a basketball, just bobbing there a few feet off the ground. At first, I thought it might be some trick of my equipment, so I looked through my thermal scope. And that's when I got goosebumps. The temperature reading on the sphere was around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It was at least 30 degrees colder that night, so seeing that reading freaked me out. I zoomed in, tried refocusing, but the second I switched modes, the sphere vanished. It was like it blinked out of existence, leaving that patch of forest dark again. I scanned back and forth, but it was gone. I stood there for a minute, breathing heavy, feeling my heart pound in my ears. Trying to shake it off, I took a few steps closer, thinking maybe there was some weird reflection or piece of gear messing with me. But I knew my equipment well, and nothing about that red light made sense. That's when the real trouble started. My night vision viewer suddenly dimmed. Then it turned off, turned on again, and flickered in these random intervals. I replaced batteries 2 nights before, so it shouldn't have been a power issue. Still, I couldn't get the brightness stable. The forest felt different at that point. I can't explain it except to say I felt watched. Usually in the woods, if you stand still long enough, you sense animals skittering around, or you hear branches creaking in the wind. But there was only this suffocating quiet. No breeze, no movement. It felt like the trees were listening. Then came a sound that made me nearly drop my rifle. A laugh. It was faint, almost metallic, echoing through the trees. It started off sounding far away, but got closer and closer, even though I couldn't see anyone. I froze. Part of me wanted to call out, but the idea of shouting into that silence terrified me. I thought maybe it was my neighbor playing a sick joke, but it didn't sound normal. It had this distorted quality that made my spine crawl. My mind was racing with possibilities, someone trespassing, some messed up echo from an animal, or maybe a weird glitch in my hearing. But it kept happening, short bursts of laughter that would fade, then show up from another direction. My breath felt shallow and cold in my chest. I could have sworn I heard leaves crunch somewhere off to my left, so I swung my thermal scope around, trying to pick up any heat signatures. But my scope was still flickering, making it impossible to get a steady view. That's when I caught a glimpse of something. It was small, about the height of a medium-sized dog, but the shape wasn't like any coyote or fox I'd ever seen. It darted between the tree trunks so fast I barely had time to focus. Through the flicker, I saw a bright patch of heat, but it was distorted. I tried to follow it, but my scope went haywire again, shutting off completely for a few seconds. By the time it came back on, there was nothing. I'd been out there long enough. My gut told me to leave. Something wasn't right. I slowly backed up toward my house, feeling that weird pressure in the air, hearing occasional bursts of that laughter echoing behind me. I was so tense I could hardly open the back door when I got home because my hand was shaking. The next morning, I went to check with my neighbor. She swore she hadn't left her place and hadn't heard anything. Another older resident in the area mentioned some local legend about a forest spirit that causes confusion and plays tricks on hunters. I don't normally believe in that stuff, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. It all felt too real. I haven't had a repeat of that exact experience. Ever since that night, though, I can't walk into the woods without feeling uneasy. The equipment malfunction still baffles me, and I've had zero luck recreating it with fresh gear or testing it indoors. Whatever that red sphere was, whatever those laughs were, it never gave me any solid proof. It just happened, then stopped, leaving me with this knot in my stomach that still hasn't fully untied. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I just know what I experienced. Even with all my training and top-notch gear, I was completely out of my depth. Part of me wonders if the forest was just reminding me that it holds mysteries we can't always explain. And to this day, I can't say exactly what I encountered out there. But I can still hear that eerie laughter sometimes when I lie in bed, trying to forget it. Story 7. I still feel uneasy whenever I think about that night. It happened in early 2023, while I was staying at my family's property in Hillside, Texas. The place is surrounded by thick woods, and even though I've been there countless times, I'd never felt so on edge before. People in my family had already mentioned strange noises at night, specifically something that sounded like a running saw. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe somebody was cutting wood at an odd time, or maybe there was some machine echoing from far away. But considering there aren't many neighbors in that area, the sounds made no sense. One evening, my cousins and I were sitting around trying to relax when we heard it again. It was just after sundown, and this noise cut through the silence like a buzzsaw revving up. It would start, stop, then start again. It made my skin crawl because it didn't follow any kind of normal pattern. My cousin and I decided to go check it out, partly because we were curious, partly because we wanted to rule out anything mundane. We grabbed flashlights, nothing fancy, and headed out toward the higher ground, where the sound seemed to be coming from. We walked along the dirt path, our boots crunching on loose gravel. Every now and then, that saw-like sound would fire up, then shut off abruptly. It was worse when it stopped, because we realized how dark and quiet everything else was. I remember my heart thumping in my ears, matching the tension in the air. We tried to keep calm, but it felt like something was waiting for us to come closer. The only thing guiding us was that faint mechanical noise, starting and stopping in the distance. As we moved deeper into the trees, I noticed the tall pines blocking more and more of the moonlight. We'd sweep our flashlights around, hoping to catch sight of a person or maybe a piece of equipment. But there was nothing, just shadows and rustling leaves. Every time we thought we were getting closer to the source, the noise would vanish, as if it was never there to begin with. Then, once we stopped and backed off, it would blare again from another direction. At one point, we turned off our lights for a moment, thinking we might see a glow or something that could give away a machine. We stood there, holding our breath. There was nothing but silence. My cousin leaned over and whispered that maybe we should head back, but I felt this stubborn curiosity that kept me rooted in place. Then, out of nowhere, that saw sound ripped through the woods again. It was so close that I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't tell if it was above us, behind us, or somewhere off to the right. It was everywhere and nowhere, and it sounded like metal grinding into wood. Right then, my cousin's flashlight caught movement near the base of a large tree. I couldn't make out a shape in detail, but it was tall, taller than anyone I know. It seemed to glide rather than walk. The way it moved under the moonlight made me think it was more shadow than flesh and blood. We froze, unsure of what we were even looking at. My heart started hammering 1,000,000 miles an hour, and I honestly felt like I could barely breathe. I didn't want to stick around to find out what that thing was. In that instant, both of us turned and started heading back. I tried not to run. I was afraid that if I broke into a sprint, it would chase me. The sound of that saw flared up once more behind us, an awful screech that felt too close. My hands were shaking so badly that I could hardly keep my flashlight steady on the path. When we finally made it back to the main house, everyone noticed how pale we looked. We tried to explain, but it came out in broken fragments. We didn't call the authorities. We knew we'd sound crazy talking about some mysterious saw noise and a giant shadow in the woods. Still, we were freaked out enough to lock every door and window. I remember pacing around, listening for any sign that the noise had followed us. But the property was quiet, almost too quiet. Later that night, I felt like something was just beyond the tree line, observing us. Every time I glanced out the window, I expected to see that tall silhouette move past. My aunt and uncle told us they'd heard similar stories dating back years, about strange sounds in the forest that seemed to mimic tools or animals, luring people in. I wished I could believe it was just local folklore. But after what I saw, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there. By morning, the air felt lighter, and it almost seemed like a bad dream. I know what I witnessed, though. and I've never found a logical explanation. Nobody in my family can either. We still hear accounts from neighbors, echoes that sound like metal clanging, or short, sharp cries that could be anything but never match up with normal wildlife. Some folks say it's a spirit. Some claim it's just the wind bouncing through the valley. I don't know. All I know is that ever since that night, I've been uneasy whenever dusk settles over those woods. There's a deep sense of dread that creeps in, as if the forest itself is aware of us. Even now, whenever I talk about it, my mind goes back to the same question. What was that creature, and why did it imitate the sound of a saw? It's been almost a year since then, and it hasn't stopped haunting me. Sometimes I lie awake, picturing that dark shape gliding among the trees, disappearing whenever we got too close. And then, just as suddenly as it all started, the sightings and noises died down. We never heard the saw sound again after that season, and no one else in my family caught a glimpse of that shadow. It was like it all vanished into thin air, but I still can't explain it, and I probably never will. Story 8. I never expected to feel real fear on a simple hiking trail, but in the summer of 2020, out here in Deerwood, Alaska, I had one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. My husband and I love exploring the nearby woods, especially the trails that cut through the Yukon region, so it wasn't unusual for me to head out almost every morning with my husky, who absolutely lives for the outdoors. Normally, he'd be wagging his tail and sniffing everything in sight, but one day he got weirdly tense around a particular bend in the trail. It was like he spotted something I couldn't see. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was a small critter or a shape in the tree line that spooked him. But he kept refusing to go beyond this certain point, bristling and whining. A couple times, he actually yanked me backward when I tried to keep moving. It was so bizarre because this dog was usually fearless. He's not the type to get scared over nothing. But for several days in a row, he acted the same. Each time we'd hit the spot with those small, dense trees on both sides, he'd freak out. I noticed the whole area around that section seemed oddly silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It put me on edge, but I tried to stay logical. A few neighbors who used to walk there were staying away for some reason too, and when I asked around, one mentioned something off about the place, but couldn't put it into words. That only fueled my curiosity. At one point, I decided I'd had enough guessing and wanted to see for myself, but I didn't want my dog freaking out again, so I chose to go alone. And of course, I decided to do it near sundown, because apparently I wasn't thinking straight and just needed to satisfy my own restless mind. So that evening, I bundled up and headed out to the trail. Everything felt quiet right from the start, but it was the kind of quiet that almost made my ears ring. As I walked farther in, I noticed how every step felt heavier than usual. The path was partially covered with thin layers of old, packed snow, so it crunched under my boots with each step. It gave me this strange feeling, like I was intruding on a place I didn't belong. Once I neared that familiar spot where my husky always got scared, I swear the temperature dropped in an instant. My breath felt colder, and even through my thick jacket, I got this bone-deep chill. I tried to tell myself it was just the dropping sun, but something about the atmosphere felt unnatural. It was like the air was pressing in on me. My ears began to ache, almost like they do when there's a sudden shift in altitude. That's when I realized I felt watched, except I couldn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. No crunch of branches, no rustle of leaves, just nothing. I'm not usually paranoid, but my heart started pounding in my chest so hard that I could hear it in my ears. The silence became overwhelming. I kept looking around, expecting to catch some animal or a silhouette of a person in the trees, but they were just shadows stretching in the late evening light. I felt so sure I wasn't alone, though. and the more I looked, the more it felt like something was right there in my peripheral vision, just out of sight. As I stood there, my feet practically rooted in place, I noticed how the sky was transitioning into dusk way faster than I anticipated. Up here in Alaska, sunset can sometimes drag on forever, but that evening it felt like it was racing toward dark. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, so I took a few steps forward, maybe out of stubbornness or the need for some kind of proof, and that's when I heard the faintest sound. It was almost like a distant hum or chant, so soft I wasn't sure if it was in my head or outside of it. That was enough for me. I'm not one to run from the woods, but the tension in my gut and the fear creeping up my spine told me it was time to go. I whipped around and speed-walked back the way I came, trying not to full-on sprint so I wouldn't trip. My ears kept that dull pressure, and the echo of that weird hum followed me, even though I couldn't really tell if I was imagining it. Every few seconds I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something behind me. But there was nothing, just the dimming trees and endless shadows. By the time I got home, I was nearly out of breath and shaking. My husband took one look at my face and knew something had genuinely rattled me. I explained it all to him, how quiet it was, the sudden chill, that feeling of being watched. We did some hurried digging online and found random local stories about people hearing strange chanting or seeing flickers of movement between the trees, but nothing was concrete. Just enough to make us realize we weren't the only ones who'd felt something lurking out there. After that evening, I steered clear of that particular route for a long while. When I'd pass by in the car or walk near it on a different path, my husky would still get tense, pulling away and glaring at those dense pines like he expected something to leap out. I don't know if there's something supernatural in those woods or just a bigger predator that stays out of sight, but it felt more than just a simple bear or wolf. The silence there was too unnerving, too stifling, and that pressure in the air didn't feel natural. Eventually, people around the area started using the trail again. Nothing big ever made the news, and no one ever reported missing hikers or anything like that as far as I know. Life pretty much went on as if it was never a big deal. Still, whenever I think about that specific day, I get a knot in my stomach. I can't fully explain what happened or why everything felt so wrong, but I believe my husky knew something was off from the start. Whatever it was, I'm just glad I listened to my instincts that evening and got out of there. To this day, I've never had another incident like that, and I haven't heard updated stories from other folks in Deerwood. But I can't forget it. Whenever I look at those woods at dusk, I swear I feel that same chill creep across my skin, and my ears remember that painful, pressurized ache. It all started without warning and ended just as suddenly. I still don't have any answers. All I know is something about that place goes beyond normal explanation, and I'm in no hurry to test my luck again. Story 9. I still get chills when I think about those hours I spent at Minister Creek back in 2021, tucked deep in the Allegheny National Forest. Honestly, I'd heard of the place before. Friends talking about how peaceful it was, how you could camp by these beautiful valleys, fish in the creek, and basically forget about the outside world. I never expected it to become one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. There was something in those woods that I can't fully explain, and even though it's been a while, I still can't shake the uneasy feeling it left in me. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip, just a few of us who loved the outdoors, but that second day, I don't even know how to put it into words without feeling my heart race all over again. We arrived in the early afternoon on a Friday. The area we picked wasn't exactly off limits, but it wasn't one of the more popular spots either. There was a sense of solitude that was initially nice, especially because we were hoping to get away from the usual crowds at more accessible campgrounds. The deeper region of Minister Creek had these steep valleys and thick clusters of trees, the kind of location you'd see on a postcard if it wasn't so hidden. When we got there, we parked our cars along a dirt path and hiked in with our packs, setting up our tents near a stretch of the creek where the water was a bit calmer. The plan was to fish, gather wood, maybe explore a few trails we'd found on a topographic map, and just have a chill weekend away from everything. The first day was uneventful in the best possible way. We walked around to familiarize ourselves with the immediate area, found a good spot by the water to fish, and took note of a clearing that looked perfect for a bonfire later. The sun was high, the sky was clear, and it felt like the forest was welcoming us. We saw a couple of squirrels running up trees, the occasional deer bounding off when we got too close, and heard the typical background soundtrack of birds calling. If you've ever spent time in a place like Allegheny, you know that the air smells different, fresher, with that earthy aroma of pine needles and damp soil. That's exactly how it was. We were excited to be out there with no obligations, just the promise of a fun time with good friends in nature. That first evening, we set up our tents in a semicircle so that the entrances faced the center. We built a small fire pit in the middle, lined it with stones we found along the creek, and put some logs over the kindling. As the sun started to set, we cooked some of the fish we'd caught earlier. Nothing fancy, just a bit of butter, salt, and pepper. But out there, it tasted better than any meal I'd had in a while. We swapped stories about previous camping adventures, joked about the mosquito bites we knew were coming, and talked excitedly about the next morning's plan to do a longer hike into one of the nearby valleys. Everything was completely normal, exactly how you'd imagine a casual camping trip would be. Around midnight, we started to turn in. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the air got colder than I'd expected. But inside the tent, I felt comfortable, drifting off to the sound of crickets and the soft gurgling of the creek nearby. I don't know what time it was, but in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly to this deep, resonating sound. At first I thought maybe I'd been dreaming. My mind registered something like a distant thunderclap, but it wasn't quite that. It had a deeper, more echoey quality, and it seemed to bounce off the valley walls. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside, expecting maybe to see some lightning, or at least a sky full of storm clouds. But there was nothing, just darkness and the faint outlines of the trees under a cloudless sky. I listened carefully for a while, barely breathing, trying to figure out if it was just in my head. Then I heard it again, a low boom, like a massive drum being struck in the far distance. It made the ground feel like it was humming under my sleeping pad, but that could have been just my adrenaline kicking in. Other people were stirring too. I could hear zippers from their tents and muffled, "What was that?" type exclamations. But no one came fully out. We were all curious, a little spooked, but not enough to think we were in danger. My friend on the other side of the camp called over, something like, "Is that thunder?" I just shrugged, even though I knew they couldn't see me. Maybe that's all it was, some weird atmospheric thing. It was certainly loud and strange, but we were in a valley, and sound can do weird things in those environments. I told myself not to overthink it. Eventually, the booms stopped. As soon as the sound ceased, it felt like the entire forest went quiet with it. The crickets, the owls, everything just froze, almost like someone hit the mute button. It was so eerie. My pulse was racing. I kept scanning the dark, half expecting something to materialize. But after a few minutes, I realized I was just standing there, getting cold for no reason, so I slipped back inside my sleeping bag. It took me a while to drift off again, but eventually, fatigue won. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't such a big deal. Over coffee and oatmeal, we all compared notes. One person had thought it was a small earthquake. Another suggested maybe a big rock slide somewhere in the distance. The Allegheny region is known for its rocky terrain, so it wasn't the craziest theory. We laughed it off a bit, deciding that if it were some catastrophic event, we would have seen other signs. We didn't, so we let it go. We spent the day exploring, just like we'd planned. We followed this trail that wound through dense undergrowth and led to a scenic overlook of the creek. It was beautiful. The sun was out again, the temperature was perfect, and we had the place practically to ourselves. A couple of hikers passed us going the opposite direction, but otherwise we encountered no one. We ended up back at our camp by late afternoon, tired but satisfied. We grilled up more fish, plus some hot dogs we'd brought as backup, and it was another nice, lazy evening, at least at first. Once the sky started to shift into that orange-pink twilight, though, I felt a creeping sense of unease. I can't really explain it well, but it was like the forest was waiting. My brain kept flashing back to that strange booming sound from the night before. I tried to tell myself that it was silly to be on edge, that we'd be fine and nothing weird would happen again. But I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to just regular old, I'm in the middle of nowhere and the darkness is messing with me vibes. Soon the night settled in. We put our campfire together once more, the glow casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. People were joking around, telling stories, or scrolling through their phones in the few areas where we could get a signal. The normal stuff you'd expect. But then, around 10 p.m., that uneasy vibe seemed to intensify for me. I remember looking out into the darkness beyond the ring of firelight and getting this stomach-churning sense that we weren't as alone as we thought. The wind started picking up a bit, rustling the leaves, and every snap of a twig made me jump. Still, there was nothing obviously out of place, no sign of a person or an animal prowling around. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the conversation around me, but it wasn't working too well. Eventually, one by one, we all decided to call it a night. We'd done a lot of hiking, and the plan was to get an early start out of there the next morning. I climbed into my tent again, zipped the door shut, and got comfortable. The forest noises were back in full swing, crickets chirping, a distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind. It was a soothing backdrop, and I remember feeling my eyelids get heavy. Just as I was on the edge of sleep, though, I heard something that made my whole body tense up. It was a movement, soft and deliberate, right outside the nylon wall of my tent. Not footsteps exactly, more like a shuffling. For a second I froze, holding my breath. My mind raced through the possibilities. A deer, a raccoon, some other harmless critter rummaging around. That's common enough in these parts. But this sounded heavier than a raccoon or a fox, and less graceful than a deer. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my heart pounding in my ears. Could it be a bear? That was a real concern, though we'd taken precautions to store our food properly. Even so, you never know. I slowly, as quietly as possible, reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on and aimed it at the tent wall. The light lit up the interior, and I could see a silhouette move. I swear it looked like a person. My brain was screaming at me. That's not an animal. That's someone standing there. I almost called out, but something stopped me. The fear that if there was some random stranger prowling around our campsite in the middle of the night, maybe I didn't want them to know I was awake. So I just watched, trembling, barely breathing. The figure lingered for a couple more seconds, then shifted away, disappearing from the beam of my flashlight. My mind spun with possibilities. Could it be one of my friends? But why would they be creeping around so quietly without using their own flashlight? That made no sense. At some point, I mustered the courage to unzip the tent a few inches and peer out. I scanned the darkness, passing my flashlight beam across the trees. Nothing. Not a single trace of whoever or whatever I'd just seen. By this time, my nerves were on high alert. I debated if I should call out to the others, but a part of me felt like I might just be scaring everyone for no reason. We'd encountered hikers earlier in the day, but they all seemed normal enough. Also, it wasn't unheard of for someone to wander off to take a leak at night, though typically You'd hear them or see them with a headlamp. This was different. This felt wrong. Ultimately, I retreated back into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there wide awake, heart hammering so loud I thought it might burst through my chest. That's when the drumming started. It was faint at first, so quiet I almost doubted my own ears. Then it grew more pronounced, a rhythmic beating, like distant tribal drums echoing through the valley. I can't even put into words how disorienting it was. It had a pattern, kind of like thump, 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 pause, thump, thump, thump. Then silence. Then it would start again, slightly faster or slower. It didn't match the tempo of normal sounds, like someone banging on a tree trunk or a woodpecker or anything I could logically explain. It was so distant that it was hard to pinpoint the exact direction, but it was definitely coming from somewhere out in the forest. My stomach tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Part of me wanted to rationalize it. Maybe it's a group of people a mile away doing some late-night drumming around their own campfire, or kids messing around with some instrument. But we were supposed to be the only ones in this area. We'd have known if someone set up a campsite near us because we'd hiked most of these trails earlier. I heard movement in the other tents. People were awake, and they'd noticed the sound too. Someone unzipped their tent and shined a beam of light around, calling out, "Hey, is that you?" Another voice muttered something about how weird this was. I was relieved I wasn't the only one hearing it, but that relief quickly turned into a deeper sense of dread. We all ended up outside, huddled near the center of the camp, flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The drumming continued. Then it would fade. Then it would pick up again. One of my friends was whispering that it had to be some acoustic trick of the valley, but you could tell by the look on their face they were as uneasy as the rest of us. The flashlight beams revealed nothing but dense trees and a light layer of mist that had started to form. The temperature seemed to drop unexpectedly. My breath was coming out in faint puffs, which made no sense because it wasn't that cold earlier. We were all on edge, scanning the perimeter, looking for any sign of another person or group. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably just a few minutes of searching. Then, out of nowhere, the drumming stopped. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, like the forest itself was holding its breath. No owls, no crickets, not even the rustle of leaves. It was absolute stillness. I don't remember who said it first, but someone suggested we pack up and just get the hell out of there. However, it was already late, and trying to navigate the trails back to our cars in the dark with that weird mist rolling in didn't sound like the safest plan. We weighed our options, stay until morning, but remain vigilant, or try to hike out now. The consensus was to wait it out, strength in numbers, keep a watch, and leave first thing at dawn. We each grabbed our lanterns and placed them around the camp perimeter to get more light. Then we pulled out any extra flashlights we had and tried to set up a kind of makeshift watch system. I was with a friend who was equally spooked, and we stayed outside our tents, scanning the dark for movement. Another friend crawled back into their tent, trying to get a bit of rest before we switched out. The plan was to rotate every couple of hours. We didn't really talk much. There was nothing to say. My mind kept replaying that silhouette I'd seen behind my tent. Was it a person? Had it followed us during the day? I couldn't piece it together, and every time I thought I heard a twig snap or leaves crunch, my stomach lurched. Time crawled by. The night pressed in on us, and I found myself squinting into the trees, thinking I saw shapes moving just beyond our lamplight. A couple of times I swear I spotted a figure, but each time I aimed my flashlight it was gone, just shadows dancing in the dark or a trick of the mist. My rational side said I was letting my imagination run wild, but my instincts were screaming that something was out there watching. The quiet was overwhelming. Even the creek's gentle murmur seemed muted. And then the drumming started again. This time it was fainter, but definitely there. a steady, rhythmic pulse that felt like it was coming from multiple directions. My heart began pounding in sync with it, like my body was reacting to that disturbing beat. We all stood up, shining flashlights around, trying to find its source. The sound would swell for a moment, then recede, like waves hitting a shore. It created a disorienting echo effect in the valley. Even though I couldn't see anything, I felt corners of my vision darken with panic, the adrenaline spike hitting me hard. I heard someone whisper, "Oh God," under their breath. None of us had a good explanation. We'd gone camping countless times, and we'd never heard anything like it. The drumming lasted maybe 2 or 3 minutes this time, then it cut off abruptly. Again, that suffocating silence followed. By this point, my nerves were shot. I was ready to leave everything behind and just speed walk out of there by the glow of my flashlight. But we decided to stick to the plan, wait for morning. We gathered closer around the fire pit, stoking the coals to bring up some more light and heat. The temperature continued to drop, and a thin fog crept through the trees, drifting into our campsite. It was like a scene out of a nightmare, the kind you wake from in a cold sweat. Except this was very real. I could feel the cold dampness of the fog on my cheeks, smell the faint scent of rotting leaves it carried. One of my friends started muttering about how they'd heard stories from some local folks about strange noises in these woods. They'd always assumed it was just tall tales or old folklore. I'd heard the rumors too, whispered accounts of weird drumming in remote sections of Allegheny, connected to old traditions or ceremonies that predated modern settlements. But it all seemed so far-fetched, more of a campfire story than anything factual. Yet here we were, living it. None of us had concrete proof of what was going on. No pictures or recordings, just the raw experience that was making every hair on my body stand on end. We tried to keep talking quietly among ourselves, hoping that conversation would help the time pass faster and calm our nerves. Nobody laughed, nobody even made jokes to lighten the mood. We were too spooked. The fog thickened, and it was hard to see more than a few feet beyond the ring of lanterns and the soft glow of the fire's embers. I remember constantly glancing over my shoulder, my ears straining to catch any sound. Every small noise, a twig snapping, a leaf falling, made me stiffen. Time felt stretched and distorted, as if the night refused to end. In the midst of this, something far in the woods let out a high-pitched shriek. It wasn't a human scream, but it also didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was piercing and abrupt, then cut off, leaving an echo that felt like it reverberated in my chest. My heart practically stopped. One of my friends exclaimed under their breath, and another fumbled with their flashlight, shining it wildly in the direction of the noise. But the forest was just an endless curtain of darkness and fog. Nobody could see a thing. We all went dead silent, hearts hammering. I could taste the fear in my mouth like a metallic tang. Nobody moved. We just stood there, waiting to see if it would happen again. For a moment, I thought I saw a faint glimmer or reflection between the tree trunks, as if eyes were looking back at us. But it disappeared almost as soon as I registered it. We didn't hear that shriek again. Instead, the forest returned to that unnerving hush. I was certain at this point that something was toying with us. Whether it was an actual person or some unknown creature, I can't say. But it felt like we were being watched, and the drumming and the shriek were designed to scare us. If that was the goal, it was working. I was beyond frightened. My hands were shaking, and I could barely keep my flashlight steady. We decided that if the sounds didn't stop, we'd risk it and hike back to the cars in the dark. Our mental state couldn't take much more of this. For what felt like hours, we just stood or sat near the fire, doing our best to stay calm. The damp air clung to my clothes, and my teeth started chattering. Occasionally, one of us would say something like, "Anyone else see that?" Or, "Did you hear that?" But mostly, We just listened and watched, painfully aware of every tiny movement in our surroundings. That's the thing about fear. It sharpens your senses to the point where you're practically vibrating with tension, noticing every flicker of a shadow. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, just a little. The thick canopy overhead kept the area dark, but I could see the faintest hint of dawn through a gap in the trees. That small change felt like a lifeline. We stirred, collecting our scattered gear and stuffing it back into our backpacks, not caring much about tidiness. I remember fumbling with the tent stakes, my fingers numb, and yanking them out of the ground. We moved like we were on a mission, our eyes darting around constantly, half expecting to hear that drumming start again, or that scream pierce the air. But nothing came. It was as if, once the night began to fade, so did the presence that had tormented us. In the early morning light, the fog still loomed over the forest floor, but it wasn't as thick. We could see our immediate surroundings more clearly. Nobody spoke. We were all too jittery, too eager to get out. We basically marched out of there, following the same trail we'd come in on, forming a single file line. Now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see a figure trailing behind us. Each time, I only saw the mist and the tall shapes of the trees, but the dread in the pit of my stomach wouldn't let up until we finally reached our vehicles. Once we got to the cars, we loaded everything as fast as we could. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my keys. We didn't even do a proper roll call or anything, just an unspoken consensus that we'd regroup once we were miles away from that place. The drive back felt surreal. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half convinced I'd see someone or something come charging out onto the road behind us. But it never happened. We left Minister Creek and the Allegheny National Forest behind us, physically at least. Mentally, it took a lot longer for me to stop looking over my shoulder at every small sound for weeks after. When we finally pulled into a rest stop on the way back, we talked briefly about what had happened. We were all rattled. Some people tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some other campers messing with us, or a group performing some kind of ritual or music experiment in the woods. The shriek could have been a fox or some other animal that has an odd vocalization. But no explanation fully clicked. The timing, the feeling of being watched, the shadows moving around us, it all just felt too unnerving to be a bunch of coincidences. And the truth is, we never did figure it out. The sounds, the silhouettes, the drumming that echoed like it was coming from multiple directions, it just stopped that morning. And that was that. I've told a few people about this since then, and some believe me, some don't. I can't really blame the skeptics. It sounds like a story someone might fabricate for a ghost hunting show or an urban legend website. But it happened, and to this day, I can't explain most of it. The forest can be a strange place, full of noises and phenomena that defy easy explanation. Still, I've camped in plenty of remote areas, and I've never experienced anything quite like that. Minister Creek is the only place that ever made me feel genuinely scared in a primal way, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be a part of. We did go back to the general region of Allegheny on subsequent trips, but never again to that secluded valley in Minister Creek. Instead, we picked more popular campgrounds where we'd see other people around. Safety in numbers, I guess. Even then, every crack of a branch at night would cause flashbacks. I'd remind myself that sure, maybe the forest has its quirks, but we were probably safe. Yet I couldn't fully relax like I used to. I'd lie awake sometimes, listening for that drumming, terrified that it might start up again somewhere in the distance. But it never did, at least not in the areas we stayed after that. Looking back, the strangest part for me is how abruptly it all ceased. We heard those thunderous booms, the drum beats, saw shapes moving around, endured that blood-curdling shriek, and then everything just went silent. No trace of footsteps, no disturbed brush, no sign of anyone having been there. It left us with a lot of unanswered questions and a lingering sense that we'd brushed up against something we shouldn't have. I don't necessarily mean something supernatural. It could just be that we got in the crosshairs of a person or group that thrives on scaring campers. But even that explanation feels hollow when I recall how distinctly otherworldly those beats sounded, how impossible it was to figure out their origin. I still reflect on that night sometimes, especially if the topic of weird camping experiences comes up. People ask if I'd go back under the same conditions, and I always say, no way. Not because I believe in ghosts or forest spirits or anything like that, but because I know how intense the fear was, how real it felt in that moment. Once you've been truly scared like that out in the wilderness, you gain a deep respect for how vulnerable you really are. We might think we're prepared. Flashlights, tents, knives, survival gear, but none of that helps when your mind starts to turn on you, or when something out there is playing with your senses. I'm not the same camper I was before that trip. I still love nature, still find peace in the woods, but I'm far more cautious. I make sure to research any place I'm going, check for any local reports of strange occurrences, and I make sure we camp where other people are at least nearby. Some might say that defeats the purpose of getting away from it all, but after what happened, I need that bit of reassurance. It's a small price to pay for peace of mind. Even as I'm writing this, remembering the sequence of events, the booming sounds, the silhouettes, the drumming, the shriek, I feel my pulse quicken. The night's images come flooding back. The flickering lanterns, the fog creeping across the campsite, the damp chill that settled into my bones, and the suffocating quiet that enveloped the forest once the drumming stopped. It's like reliving a nightmare. And honestly, I still can't say what it was. Maybe the region has some kind of acoustic phenomenon that produces drum-like echoes, or maybe it's a tradition carried out by some reclusive group. Some locals hinted at old legends about drumming in those forests, tied to ancient rites or ceremonies, but nobody had proof. All I know is that it happened, we all experienced it, and it left us shaken to the core. The memory that sticks with me the most is standing there, flashlight in hand, seeing that humanoid silhouette right against my tent wall. That was the single most terrifying moment for me. It confirmed that the presence we felt wasn't just noise or illusions. It had a form, a shape, presumably a body, and it was close, just a thin layer of fabric away from me. The knowledge that it vanished so quickly, without a rustle or footstep, still freaks me out. People say, maybe it was your friend, or you sure it wasn't just a weird shadow? But I know what I saw. The shape was there, and then it wasn't. After that night, we never managed to find a rational explanation that satisfied all of us. It became one of those topics we'd tiptoe around. If someone brought it up, the conversation would go for a few minutes, and then we'd move on quickly, like we didn't want to stir up the memory too much. It's easy to talk about in broad strokes. We heard some freaky noises in the woods once, but when I try to describe the details, I can see the goosebumps forming on my arms as I relive it. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can feel the damp earth under my feet, smell the smoke of the dying fire, and sense the looming darkness pressing in. It's not something I want to dwell on, but it's there, etched in my mind. I've had people ask if maybe we all just shared a hallucination of some kind, or if we ate something bad that caused us to hallucinate. But the drumming, the silhouette, the shriek, none of that feels like a group hallucination. We were all clear-headed, just a bit tired from hiking, but not out of our minds. And we packed our own food, which was mostly pre-packaged or freshly caught fish cooked thoroughly. No, this wasn't some mass hysteria or trick of the mind. It was real enough to make us leave at first light, real enough that I couldn't bring myself to stay a minute longer than necessary. What's especially chilling is talking to locals later and hearing that they'd heard bits and pieces about weird experiences around Minister Creek. Nothing well documented, no official reports, just rumors and second-hand stories about people hearing rhythmic beats, seeing strange lights or shapes in the woods at night, feeling an uncanny presence. Some connect it to ancient Native American traditions, others chalk it up to secret gatherings or just plain old tall tales. But nobody seems to have a definitive answer, and maybe that's worse, knowing there are other accounts out there, but no one can explain them. Despite everything, part of me remains curious. There's a corner of my mind that wants to go back in broad daylight, explore the area thoroughly, see if I can find any sign of an old campsite or a hidden structure. But I know I won't do it, at least not alone, and probably not without a big group of people. The fear is still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. Why poke the hornet's nest when you've already been stung? These days, whenever I go camping, I pack extra flashlights, set up perimeter lights, and always keep a better watch system. It might be overkill, but after what we went through, I don't mind being a little paranoid. I'd rather be cautious and safe. So far, I haven't encountered anything remotely similar on any of my other trips, which is a relief. But that doesn't change the fact that, on one particular night in 2021, at Minister Creek in the Allegheny National Forest, I experienced a string of events that defy easy explanation. Sometimes, late at night, I'll replay it in my head, searching for a detail or clue I might have missed. Maybe a path or some footprints that would confirm a person was behind this. But I come up empty every time. All I have are those vivid memories, the pounding of my heart matching the strange drum beats echoing off the valley walls, the swirling mist, the unshakable certainty that someone was inches away from me on the other side of the tent fabric. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. The morning sun rose, the sounds vanished, the sense of dread lifted, and we walked out of there with more questions than answers. I still don't know what that was, but I know one thing: I will never forget it. Even if decades pass, and I'm telling stories to whoever will listen, this one will always send a shiver down my spine. And every time I close my eyes and imagine those woods, I can't help but feel like there's something ancient and enigmatic slumbering there, occasionally stirring to remind us that we don't know everything that lurks in the deep, hidden corners of the world. That second night at Minister Creek showed me the forest can be as mysterious and haunting as any horror tale. We walked away unscathed physically, but mentally, I'm not so sure. That place claimed a piece of my peace of mind, and I haven't fully gotten it back since. So, that's what happened. It began with a peaceful, almost idyllic day, and ended in an unsettling confrontation with sounds, shapes, and a suffocating fear that came out of nowhere and then vanished just as fast. To this day, I have no logical explanation, no sense of closure. All I have are my memories and a lingering dread whenever I recall the echo of those distant drums. Nothing like that has ever happened to me before or since, and I hope it stays that way. I don't need another sleepless night in a cold fog, staring into the pitch-black forest, wondering if each flicker of a shadow is something waiting to pounce. Once was more than enough, and that's the unsettling truth. It just ended. The drumming, the silhouettes, the crushing sense of being watched, it all halted by the time dawn arrived, leaving us with our racing hearts and our hurried footsteps, trying to escape a place that felt like it didn't want us there. I wish I could wrap this up with a neat conclusion or a grand revelation, but the reality is far simpler and far more disturbing. Sometimes these things just happen, and they don't leave behind neat little packages of evidence. They linger in your mind, in your nightmares, and you learn to live with the fact that not everything in this world is fully understood or easily explained. That's the ending I've had to accept. It began and ended in that one harrowing stretch of a single night, a night that I'm still trying to forget, even as it remains impossible to truly erase from my memory. Story 10. I still remember every detail about that day, even though part of me wishes I could just forget. We'd been traveling around Yellowstone for a few days already, just me and my partner, both of us huge fans of road trips and outdoor adventures. By the time we got to West Yellowstone, we'd already done some of the classic sites, Old Faithful, a few of the steamy thermal basins, and a short hike in the geyser region. We'd heard from plenty of people that there's no shortage of incredible spots in the park, but I'd say that nothing prepared me for the unsettling feeling that crept up on us on our last day there. Everything started innocently enough. We woke up early, had a quick breakfast at the little cafe attached to our lodging. The memory of that place still feels warm and cozy, and decided we were finally going to take the boat out on Yellowstone Lake. It seemed like the perfect finale to our trip, something romantic, something to write home about, or so we thought. I should mention that the night before, I had the weirdest trouble sleeping. Even though the bed was comfortable and the room was cozy, I tossed and turned, feeling oddly anxious for no apparent reason. Maybe I was just on edge about taking the boat out, or maybe it was the altitude. I can't say for sure, but I recall waking up a few times in the early morning, just staring at the ceiling, thinking about the rumors we'd heard from some of the locals. They'd mentioned random stories about people going missing on the lake, stuff that was never fully documented, but always repeated in hushed tones, like urban legends. I don't typically lend too much credibility to hearsay, but something about those stories got under my skin, to the point that when I finally got out of bed and looked out our window at the faint glow of sunrise, I felt a tingle in my spine I couldn't shake off. Anyway, once we got moving, my partner was in a great mood, excited about the day, eager to get to the lake, already talking about how we'd celebrate our final afternoon in Yellowstone. I tried to match that enthusiasm, but deep down I felt this nagging hesitation. I told myself I was just being silly. After all, we'd been on dozens of lakes before, some far rougher than Yellowstone Lake could ever be. And besides, we had all our gear: life jackets, a reliable boat, a decently powerful motor. We'd done our research, checked the weather forecast, and it all looked fine. So we hopped in the car, towing the boat behind us, and set off for the lake access ramp near the marina area. The drive itself was calm. We passed by a few small shops still closed, saw some early birds heading out with their fishing rods, and basically felt like we had the day to ourselves. It was that typical Yellowstone atmosphere: fresh mountain air, the possibility of spotting bison or elk on the roadside, the steam rising off random patches of ground. It always felt surreal, like being in another world. When we arrived at the ramp, the water looked somewhat serene from a distance, though there was a slight wind. Actually, it was a bit stronger than I expected. The fishermen we ran into were already there, prepping their boats, sipping coffee, talking quietly among themselves. We decided to ask a couple of them for advice, because there's nothing like local knowledge. They were friendly, but there was this quiet seriousness in the way they spoke. They mentioned that the lake's conditions can change in the blink of an eye. Waves can come out of nowhere, especially with the wind patterns in that region. One older guy, wearing a flannel jacket and a trucker hat, gave us a stern warning that the water temperature was still extremely cold, even though it was late in the year. He said something about how people underestimate the risk of hypothermia if they end up in the water, and then he alluded to a few incidents where people's boats capsized and they were never found. I watched his expression as he said it. He didn't look like he was spinning a ghost story. He genuinely seemed concerned. That's when another fisherman chimed in with something about how, in some cases, the lake just doesn't give people back. That phrase stuck with me. The lake doesn't give people back. It was a casual remark, but it sent a jolt through my stomach. Despite that odd feeling in the pit of my stomach, we were still determined to enjoy our last day. We'd come prepared. The weather forecast didn't predict any major storms, and there were already several boats out on the water. If they could do it, why not us, right? We thanked the fishermen for their advice, nodded politely at their warnings, and proceeded to lower our boat into the water. I remember the squeak of the winch, the splash as the hull touched the lake, and that crisp, cold air brushing against my face. The first few minutes were actually pleasant. The waves were gentle, nothing too intimidating. We zipped across the surface, snapping pictures, commenting on how clear the water looked near the shoreline. We saw a couple of eagles overhead, and for a moment I felt myself relax. All the anxiety from the night before started to fade away. It was beautiful out there, truly. Then, out of nowhere, the wind began to pick up. At first, it was just a mild gust, but within minutes, the ripples on the lake started turning into choppy waves. I remember glancing at the horizon and noticing this darker patch of clouds moving in faster than I would have liked. It wasn't a full-blown storm or anything, but the wind started howling in an ominous way, and the temperature felt like it dropped a few degrees in a short span of time. We tried to hold our course, thinking maybe it would pass quickly, but the boat began rocking more violently, waves splashing against the sides. My partner and I exchanged nervous looks. This had escalated way more quickly than we anticipated. We felt a thud as the boat smacked into a larger wave, sending a spray of icy water over us. That was enough to make me say, "Okay, let's not push our luck." We agreed we'd head back, no questions asked. The return trip to the dock was no less nerve-wracking. The waves seemed to grow taller with every minute, and the wind was relentless. It was the kind of wind that makes your eyes tear up and your knuckles turn white as you grip the steering wheel, or in this case, the boat's throttle and wheel. When we finally made it back to the launch area, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, pun intended. The fishermen from earlier were still around, and they saw how rough the conditions had become, so they hurried over to help us haul the boat back onto the trailer. While we were wrestling with straps and the crank, they kept warning us that the lake had a reputation for surprising people. One guy said we made the right call, that it's better to be safe than be in a missing person story. I appreciated the help, but my nerves were frayed, and I just wanted to be somewhere warm and secure. Back in the parking lot, while we were catching our breath, I noticed my partner was as white as a sheet. I felt my own heart racing, my mind replaying the turbulence on the water. We both looked at each other, and without speaking, we knew we'd had enough boat time for one day. We thanked the fishermen again, locked everything up, and decided we'd do something more low-key for the remainder of our time. I remember us discussing the fact that we'd heard about these missing people cases, but had never seen any real documentation. It was all rumors, fishermen's tales, local lore. So we headed out from the marina area and talked about how curious it was that a few people seemed to genuinely believe these stories, like there was some dark secret about the lake that never made it into official records. It was the kind of conversation that put me on edge, but also piqued my curiosity. I think there's a part of me that loves a good mystery, even though I'm easily spooked. We thought we'd calm ourselves down by going for a short hike near the lake's edge. The logic was that we'd still get to enjoy the scenery, but from solid ground instead of from a rocking boat. So we drove a short distance to a trailhead that runs along part of the lake's perimeter. At the trail entrance, there were signs about the dangers of cold water, about how even strong swimmers can go into shock, and how quickly hypothermia can set in. There were also warnings about wildlife, bears, bison, the usual, but it was those warnings about the water temperature that lingered in my mind. It clicked with all those stories we'd heard. If someone fell overboard, even in the middle of summer, the water could be lethally cold. It made me shudder to think about it. The trail itself started off nice and wide, leading us through a patch of pines. We could still see glimpses of the lake through the trees, and every time a gust of wind rolled in, we could hear the rustle of branches and feel that rush of cold air. We didn't see many other hikers, maybe just one or two heading in the opposite direction. The solitude was peaceful at first, but as we got deeper into the trail, the atmosphere shifted. It was one of those times where silence doesn't feel relaxing, it feels heavy and tense. I noticed that even the birds seemed less vocal, like the entire area was under some hush. My partner later told me they felt it too, this subtle pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe normally. Maybe we were just worked up from our boat experience, but it felt like something more than that. After about 15 minutes of walking, we came across a small wooden sign pointing to a park service cabin or something along those lines. The sign looked old and worn, like it hadn't been replaced in years. We decided we'd check it out, thinking maybe it was some informational station or a ranger stop. The path to this cabin was narrow, covered in pine needles, and oddly quiet. No crunch of gravel, no chirping of birds. I remember the smell of damp wood and the faint sulfur scent that sometimes wafts around Yellowstone. When we finally reached the cabin, it was a simple wooden structure with a small porch. It looked like it might have once been used as a ranger outpost or an emergency shelter, but it appeared empty, no lights, no signs of activity, no other hikers around. We walked up to the porch, and the door was shut, but not locked. There was a small window, grimy with dust and soot, that offered a partial view inside. It looked like the cabin had a single room with a table, a couple of chairs, and some old equipment stacked in a corner. I couldn't make out exactly what the equipment was, maybe bins or old crates. We tried calling out, just in case someone from the park service was in there, but there was no response. We didn't exactly want to barge in uninvited, so we just lingered on the porch, wondering if we should head back. That was when I got this sudden chill, and I don't mean from the wind. It was this prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I scanned the tree line, but I didn't see anything, just swaying evergreens and a few bushes. My partner later admitted they had the same feeling, like eyes were on us from somewhere. It was probably just nerves, but it was intense enough that we both instinctively moved closer to each other. Something about that cabin and the emptiness around it felt off. I'm not a huge believer in the supernatural or anything, but the tension was nearly suffocating. We decided to leave the cabin area and continue along the main trail. By this point, both of us were a bit on edge, so we just quietly made our way, trying to enjoy the scenery, but failing miserably. It was as if the entire area had turned from picturesque to menacing in the span of an hour. Eventually, the trail brought us closer to the lakeshore, and we could see the water again, roiling with those same choppy waves we'd encountered earlier. Even from a distance, the wind whipped across the surface, creating these swirling patterns. And as I looked out over the lake, I had this uncomfortable sense that it was vast and endless, like it could swallow anything and keep it hidden forever. That was when we heard it, a sound I still can't fully explain. It was like a low moan coming from somewhere across the water. At first I thought it might be the wind whistling through the rocks or the trees. But this sounded deeper, almost like a human groan or a wail. It wasn't super loud, but it was distinct enough that we both froze. We listened for a moment, and then it was gone, replaced by the relentless gusts of wind. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the wind, or some echo across the canyon. But it left me feeling nauseous, like hearing a cry for help that you can't pinpoint. We debated whether to investigate or keep walking, but logic won out. The lake's shoreline in that spot was steep and rocky, and the water was too turbulent to see anything clearly. We weren't about to risk climbing down to the water's edge. We kept walking, looking back every few steps, half hoping we'd see another hiker or a ranger or literally anyone else. but the trail seemed deserted. We probably walked another 10 or 15 minutes in uneasy silence before we decided we'd had enough. We turned around and started heading back the way we came, feeling a weird mixture of relief for getting away from that eerie lakeshore and dread for the distance we still had to cover to get back to our car. As we approached the area where the cabin was, we noticed something peculiar. The door was slightly ajar. I swear just an hour earlier it had been closed. I can't confirm if it was latched, but it was definitely not open. Now it looked like it had been pushed open from the inside. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind had caught it. Maybe it wasn't fully shut in the first place. But we both remembered how stiff that door looked. It didn't seem like a slight breeze would have the strength to push it open unless it was already unlatched. And if someone was inside, why hadn't they responded earlier when we called out? We paused for a second, uncertain whether we should investigate. My partner took a few steps onto the porch, carefully peeking into the cabin through the crack in the door. After a moment, they stepped back, eyes wide, and whispered that it looked exactly the same as before: table, chairs, old gear, but there was a faint odor inside, something like mildew mixed with stagnant air, as if the cabin had been sealed for ages and suddenly let out a stale breath. I felt that prickling on my neck again, and I insisted we just keep going. We were freaked out enough, and there was no point risking anything. So we continued back down the narrow path to the main trail. I can't explain it, but the entire environment felt heavier than before, like the forest itself was pressing in on us. The wind kept picking up, rustling branches overhead, and each gust felt charged with tension. By the time we got to our car, the sky had gone overcast again, casting a dim light across the lake. We looked back at the water, and it was still churning. It felt like we were looking at a living thing, something that had moods and secrets. And maybe that's just me projecting, but at that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was, well, I don't want to say malevolent, but definitely not friendly. We stowed our gear, made sure the boat was secure on the trailer, and decided to head back into town. We were both subdued on the drive, replaying everything that happened. The near fiasco on the boat, the warnings from the fishermen, that unexplainable moan across the water, and the bizarre cabin. When we got into West Yellowstone proper, we stopped at a small diner to warm up with coffee. I remember the comforting smell of pancakes and bacon, the chatter of tourists at the next table, the clinking of dishes. It was a welcome return to normalcy, but that sense of dread still lingered beneath the surface for both of us. We tried asking the waitress if she knew anything about old cabins by the shore or about missing persons in the area. She just shrugged, said something like, "I've heard the usual rumors, but nothing official." No real help there. We spent some time at the local shops, half-heartedly looking at souvenirs, but it felt like we were both just trying to distract ourselves from the morning's events. We popped into one little store that sold handmade crafts. The owner, a sweet older lady with white hair tied in a bun, greeted us warmly. For some reason, I just felt like asking if she'd heard any stories about the lake. Maybe I was craving confirmation that we weren't crazy, that other people felt that oppressive vibe. She nodded solemnly and mentioned that her own grandfather had worked in the park decades ago, and that he used to tell her about boaters who disappeared, about how the water was so cold and deep that the bodies never surfaced. She didn't have names or dates, just the same hushed tone and seriousness we'd seen earlier. She mentioned that the Park Service rarely talks about it because in many cases there's just no official explanation. People go out, vanish, and that's it. Accidents happen, sure, but there's always a swirl of local lore that something more sinister is at play. We left the shop feeling even more uneasy, especially after everything we had just experienced firsthand. We got back in the car, and that was when we made the unanimous decision. We were done with the lake. and maybe we were done with Yellowstone for this trip. It was a shame because we loved the place, but we just couldn't shake the creeping feeling that we weren't welcome there. I know that sounds dramatic, but when you experience that kind of eeriness firsthand, it's hard to just shrug it off. I also felt this growing paranoia that the stories we'd heard might not be just folklore. When you're out there, seeing how quickly the weather shifts, how cold and uninviting the water can be, and feeling that oppressive silence in the forest, it becomes very plausible that there are hidden things no one can fully explain. We drove back to our lodging in West Yellowstone, the same place we'd woken up that morning. It was only mid-afternoon, but it felt like the day had stretched out forever. I remember dumping our gear on the bed, sitting down, and just staring at the wall, trying to make sense of the unease coiling in my stomach. My partner was pacing around, clearly agitated. We decided to try one last time to look up any official records, maybe news articles, Park Service bulletins, something. But we came up empty-handed. Just the usual caution about cold water, boat safety, and so on. No mention of missing rangers or hikers or anything of that sort. It was all either word of mouth or maybe buried in older archives that you'd only find by digging through historical documents at a local library. That was the turning point where we accepted that we wouldn't get any concrete answers. We ended up telling ourselves that we'd had a brush with nature's power and that the stories about missing people were likely just cautionary tales. But the truth is, neither of us really believed that fully. Something about the lake, the way it churned that day, the weird moan we heard, and the cabin with the open door. It felt like a puzzle piece that refused to fit neatly into an explanation. I could have chalked it all up to natural phenomena, the wind, the building storm, the shift in air pressure. But my gut still told me there was more to it. Eventually, we just decided to pack our things. We left the very next day. Even though I loved the park, something about that experience left a bad taste in my mouth. On the drive out of West Yellowstone, we were unusually quiet, only talking about mundane stuff like where to stop for gas or what to grab for lunch. It felt like that day on the lake had sapped our energy and replaced it with a lingering sense of unease. Every now and then, we'd pass another scenic spot or a sign for a hiking trail, but we just kept on driving, not in the mood for any more adventures. The strangest part is that once we were a safe distance away, somewhere past the park boundaries, that oppressive feeling lifted, almost like stepping out of a dense fog. We looked at each other, both of us acknowledging the shift, but neither wanting to talk about it out loud just yet. It was as if, once we left the domain of the lake, everything returned to normal. That night, in a different town, we finally sat down to talk it through. We recounted each detail, trying to figure out if we'd overreacted, but even when we compared notes, it was clear we both felt the same sense of dread, like the park was telling us we'd seen enough. To this day, whenever someone asks about our trip to Yellowstone, we usually stick to the highlights, the geysers, the bison, the scenic drives. But if they really press and want to know if anything weird happened, I'll sometimes open up about that last day, the boat fiasco, and how we found that empty cabin. Most people just brush it off as a spooky campfire story, or they say something like, well, nature can be scary. And I agree. Nature can be terrifying, especially when you realize how small and vulnerable you are. Yet I can't help but think there's more to it. The locals didn't talk about that lake like it was just another body of water. There was this undercurrent of genuine fear, cloaked behind cautionary advice about waves and water temperature. I've done a bit of searching since then, combing through any obscure blog posts or local newspapers I can find online. Sometimes I'll stumble upon a short mention of a boater who disappeared or a hiker who fell into the water, but it's always brief, with minimal details. Maybe that's just the nature of accidents in a place as vast as Yellowstone. There's only so much you can do once someone is missing in those frigid depths. But every once in a while, I'll see a comment from someone who had a similar experience. A mention of hearing noises near the shoreline, or finding an old outpost that gave them the creeps. It's never enough to form a solid picture, but enough to confirm that we're not alone in feeling that the lake holds secrets. The worst part for me is that I still can't fully shake the image of those waves and the sense that something was beneath them, waiting. I know how dramatic that sounds. I'm not saying there's a literal monster or anything. It's more like the lake itself exudes this presence, a reminder that if you go out there without respect, it might just keep you. We were lucky, I think, to have turned back when we did. If we'd stayed out on the water even 10 minutes longer, who knows what might have happened. We could have capsized or worse. And I know accidents happen all the time in the wilderness, but there was a malevolence in the air that day that I can't explain away with logic alone. When people say that certain places are alive, I usually roll my eyes. But Yellowstone Lake on that day, at that moment, felt alive in a way that was anything but comforting. Like it was aware of us, and not particularly happy about our presence. If that's too mystical for some folks, I get it. I'm still torn between chalking it up to extreme weather and holding on to this gut feeling that we narrowly escaped something we couldn't comprehend. All I know is that we got back with our boat in one piece, and we left with a story that still makes my heart pound whenever I replay it in my mind. Even as I write this, my hands feel clammy, remembering the cold wind and the rocking of the boat. And that moaning sound, whether it was the wind or something else, echoes in my memory. I can't describe how unsettling it is to hear what you think could be a cry for help on a lake with a reputation for swallowing people whole. There's a piece of me that wonders, if we had tried to investigate, would we have stumbled upon something we'd rather not see? Or maybe it was just the lake's natural acoustics messing with our heads. I wish I had a definitive explanation, but I don't. After that day, my partner and I have been on plenty of other adventures, other parks, other lakes, but we're both more cautious now. We double-check the local law and warnings before heading out. I haven't been back to Yellowstone since, though I'd like to, just not to that specific area by the lake. It's strange, because I love the park so much, yet I can't bring myself to revisit the spot that gave me the worst scare of my life. Maybe one day I'll work up the courage, or maybe I'll always leave it as that one place where I felt truly powerless. I guess that's the bottom line of what I want to share. If you ever find yourself at Yellowstone Lake, especially late in the year when the weather can shift unpredictably, please take the warnings seriously. There's a reason local fishermen and longtime residents repeat those stories, and if you're the type who loves exploring every hidden corner, just remember that some corners might not want you there. That day was enough to teach me respect for natural forces I don't fully understand. We made it out, but I can't say the same for everyone who's ever ventured onto that water. Whatever's lurking in those depths, be it just extreme cold, unusual currents, or something else, doesn't always let people go. In the end, our day closed on a calm, almost anticlimactic note. By evening, the wind settled a bit, the sky cleared up, and the town went back to its usual pace. It was like nothing had happened. But even though everything around us looked normal again, my heart was still pounding from the memory of those waves and that eerie quiet. Sometimes, the scariest experiences end, not with a dramatic climax, but with a sudden return to mundane reality, leaving you to wonder if it was all in your head, or if you really did brush against something unknown. That's exactly what it felt like. One minute we were in the thick of it, and the next, the world was back to business as usual, as if the day's events had never taken place at all. And that, I guess, is why I'm sharing this now. I still haven't figured it out. I don't claim to have seen ghosts or monsters, and I'm not out here trying to spin a thriller script. But it happened. Everything I've described is how I remember it, and no matter how many times I try to rationalize it, A part of me still gets chills whenever I think about that moan, that cabin, and the frantic moments on those bitterly cold, churning waters. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that sometimes nature's warnings shouldn't be ignored, and sometimes local legends hold more truth than we care to admit. Maybe the lake really does keep some people, or maybe it's all just a perfect storm of dangerous conditions and chilling rumors. Either way, that day will always be etched in my memory as the moment I realized just how small and helpless we can feel when faced with something we can't fully understand. Even now, I'll occasionally dream about that day, vivid nightmares where I'm back on the boat, the wind howling, the water rising, and the lake pulling me under. I always wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, relieved that it was just a dream. But it never completely goes away. That's how deep it got under my skin. There's no neat bow to tie on this story, no final revelation that explains everything. It just happened. And then, as quickly as it began, the day was over, and we were back in civilization, left with a million questions and no real answers. Even today, I have no explanation for the dread I felt, other than to say that sometimes places carry weight, and sometimes we pick up on it. I know this was a long read, but I hope it gives some sense of what we experienced. If anyone else has felt that same chill or heard that same low moan across Yellowstone Lake, I'd love to know, because I'm still searching for closure, or at least a hint that I'm not alone in this. Until then, all I can say is that if you find yourself out on those waters, keep your eyes and ears open and don't take anything for granted, because the day you do might be the day the lake decides it's not going to let you leave, and that's something I wouldn't wish on anyone. Stay safe and trust your instincts. That's the best advice I can offer after what happened. I guess that's all I've got. Just a lingering memory of cold waves, a mysterious cabin, and a day I'll never be able to fully explain. Story 11. I remember that afternoon in a way that still makes my chest tighten. It was late in the winter of 2022. I was living in Wentworth, Washington, close enough to the Canadian border that you could practically taste the cold in the air. A few friends and I decided to enjoy what was left of the daylight by messing around in the snow. It felt innocent enough, just a group of us trudging through knee-deep drifts, occasionally throwing snowballs and laughing whenever someone nearly slipped. The sun was that dull orange, setting behind the trees, and the light was fading fast. At some point, one of my friends stopped and stared off to the tree line, way past where our footprints trailed off. I noticed them getting quiet, squinting, like they were trying to figure out if they were seeing something real or just their imagination. They whispered that they saw a shape, hunched but tall, and it seemed to be watching us. The rest of us laughed it off for a second, but when I followed my friend's gaze, I got this creeping chill that no snowfall or cold wind could explain. I swear the air felt heavier, and for just a brief moment, it was like even the slight breeze died down. I didn't see anything concrete, just shifting shadows in that dim light. But it was enough to set me on edge. One of my buddies insisted we head back before it got darker. Even though I usually brush off weird stuff like that, I admit I felt relieved to turn around. As we walked, I had this nagging feeling that something was behind us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a fox or a deer, but I never caught anything. It was just that eerie sense that you're not alone. Inside the house, we tried to laugh off the tension. The warmth of the fireplace and the promise of hot drinks were distracting enough for a while, but every so often someone would mention that weird silhouette or how it moved, too fast, too silent. We started rationalizing right away. Maybe it was a large bird of prey, or a trick of the light against the trees. We told ourselves it had to be an animal common to the region, even though nobody could name one that fit the description of a curved, winged shape. It got dark pretty quickly. Outside, we could see the snow reflecting the moonlight, but there was something off about the way the shadows stretched across the yard. My dog, a usually laid-back golden retriever, began pacing near the window. His ears were perked, and he kept letting out low whines, which he almost never does. I looked out, squinting through the frosty glass. At first, I convinced myself I was just seeing branches swaying in the wind. But there was a moment, really brief, where it seemed like a tall, hunched outline slid behind a cluster of pines. It moved too gracefully for a person trudging through snow, yet it was too big to be just a bird. I couldn't make out any detail, but my heart started thumping so hard I felt it in my ears. I tried to show my friends, but by the time they got to the window, it was gone. They joked that I was just seeing things, or maybe it was a huge crow, but I could tell they were uneasy too. There was an odd silence outside, as if even the night creatures wanted no part of that place. No owls, no rustling in the bushes, just a heavy hush that felt like it was bearing down on us. We ended up locking the doors and pulling the curtains, which we never usually bothered with in that area. As the evening wore on, that tension didn't let up. We heard something like a single, strong beat of wings nearby. Then, nothing. My dog ran to the door, growling softly, which rattled me because I'd rarely heard him do that in the entire time I'd had him. We turned off all the lights, hoping to see outside better. But under the pale moonlight, we still couldn't catch anything except fleeting shapes at the edge of our vision. It was like staring into a half-remembered dream. The more we tried to focus, the more it vanished. At least once, I thought I saw a figure perched on a low branch, but it might have been my mind playing tricks. The shape just wasn't there when I blinked. I started feeling trapped, like we were being cornered in our own place by something we couldn't even prove existed. My thoughts kept spiraling back to other stories people in Wentworth had shared about weird sightings, shadows that hovered above the trees, unexplainable flapping sounds at night, and how everything would go dead silent right before or after. I remember reading stuff on local forums about creatures with dark wings in winter, but most folks chalked it up to local legend or just overactive imaginations. Yet in that moment, it all felt dangerously real. Eventually, we decided there was nothing else we could do but try to sleep. My friends slept over on the couches, and I barricaded my bedroom door with a chair, something I'd never felt the need to do before. The house was so quiet, I heard every creak, every random pop of the wooden walls adjusting to the cold. Every time the wind whistled, I'd jolt awake, imagining I heard wing beats or something scraping against the house. At some point in the very early morning, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. This loud rush of air, like a massive set of wings cutting through the silence. It felt close, maybe right above our roof. My dog started barking wildly, but by the time I ran to the window, I only saw the empty yard and the silhouettes of pine trees. There wasn't even a trace of footprints, just untouched snow glistening under a thin layer of moonlit frost. Not long after that it stopped. Like flipping a switch, everything went still. Even the dog seemed to relax, lying down and panting but no longer whining. I half expected to see something else, but it was like whatever had been out there decided it was done with us for the night. Or maybe it was never really interested in us to begin with, just letting us know it existed in that terrifying, elusive way. I stayed up, waiting for dawn, but nothing else happened. To this day, I can't explain what we witnessed. It never made any sense. No footprints, no real evidence, just a series of unsettling noises and glimpses of something that looked vaguely human, but not quite. Even bringing it up now, my friends get uncomfortable, like they're afraid to admit how scared we were. For a while, I tried to find similar accounts, searching for any mention of a winged humanoid creature in the region. I discovered other people had posted about random sightings, and how nature would go silent when it was around, but no one ever had concrete proof. Still, that night in Wentworth left me shaken. I haven't seen anything like it since, but every winter, especially when I catch that eerie stillness in the air, my mind goes right back to that moment by the trees. It's been haunting me ever since, even though nothing really happened, no attacks, no injuries. I can't shake the feeling that we stumbled across something we weren't supposed to see. And after all this time, I'm still not sure I want to know exactly what it was. Story 12. I still remember the exact chill of that morning when I first stepped into the forest near Graford. It was early 2023, and I had been contacted to investigate some unsettling reports about shadows moving between the trees and voices that sounded eerily like people's loved ones. I've dealt with strange cases before, but something about this place felt different. The air was cold, the sky was overcast, and the entire area around the trailhead seemed quieter than it should be. I barely heard any birds, and I didn't see a single squirrel or rabbit. It was like everything in the forest had decided to stay hidden. Local officers were already there, keeping watch on the trail that led into the thickest part of the woods. There was a tension in the air, especially because a couple had gone missing recently, and no one had any clue where they could be. I introduced myself, showed my credentials, and spoke briefly with the police chief. He seemed polite, but not entirely convinced by my expertise. That's normal for me. I'm used to the raised eyebrows and the whispers that I'm chasing ghost stories. Still, they let me do my work, as long as I was accompanied by one of their officers. I ended up paired with a younger cop named Tanner. He tried to hide it, but I could tell he was on edge from the moment we started talking. We headed off onto a less-traveled path that curved deeper into the forest. It wasn't long before I noticed some odd details: cracked branches on the ground arranged in unusual patterns, and small white fragments half buried in the dirt. At a glance, they looked like they could be animal bones, but something about their shape and the way they were scattered didn't sit right with me. I crouched down to inspect them. Tanner asked me if they could be human remains. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I just shook my head and suggested we move carefully. As we walked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air felt heavy, almost pressurized, and I could taste the dampness on my tongue. I reminded Tanner that making loud noises or calling out names might not be a good idea. People had reported hearing voices of their relatives coming from somewhere off-trail, and if something out here could mimic human speech, it was better not to give it more to work with. Tanner looked at me like I was talking nonsense, but he didn't argue. I think he was too nervous to do anything except follow my lead. About an hour in, the wind picked up, and a thin, swirling fog started to form. It was so sudden that it caught me off guard. One minute the trees looked normal, the next minute everything was hazy and shifting. I've heard of certain natural phenomena where fog appears quickly in wooded areas, especially in damp climates, but this felt almost too convenient, like it was cloaking the forest on purpose. Tanner muttered something about how weird it was, and I agreed. I kept scanning around, listening for anything that might sound out of place. That's when we heard it. A faint rustling, like something dragging across the leaves. It was so soft that for a second I thought I imagined it. We paused, and I held up my hand to signal Tanner to stay still. The rustling moved around us, circling, but it never came close enough for us to see anything. Tanner's eyes darted around, and I could hear the shallowness of his breathing. I whispered for him not to shout or panic. The last thing we needed was to draw attention, especially if these shadows and voices thrived off fear. We kept going, walking slower now. The deeper we got into the fog, the more uneasy I felt. The forest floor was covered in wet leaves, and every step made a soft squelch that echoed in the silence. Occasionally, the rustling sound would come back, this time from a different direction. It was as if something was testing us, seeing how we'd react. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice, clear as day, call my name. It wasn't Tanner, and it definitely wasn't my imagination. It came from somewhere off to our right, deeper into the trees. It sounded like a friend of mine from years ago, someone I hadn't spoken to in ages. I was so startled that I froze in place, trying to process it. Tanner whispered, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't form a coherent answer. The voice called again, my name echoing through the trees, fading into the fog. I knew it was impossible for that person to be here. Part of me wanted to investigate, to chase it down and see who or what was imitating them. But my instincts told me that was exactly what it wanted me to do. I gestured for Tanner to stay close, and we pressed on, ignoring the voice. My heart was pounding. I've experienced weird things before, but this felt personal and invasive. The forest itself seemed to get darker, even though it was still daytime. The canopy above blocked out what little sunlight there was, and the mist got thicker. We were both on high alert, stopping every few steps to listen. At one point, we found a small clearing with more scattered fragments on the ground, along with some footprints that abruptly ended at the base of a tree. It was like someone had just vanished mid-step. The prints didn't lead away from the tree. They simply stopped. Tanner looked like he was about to lose his composure. He asked if we should call for backup, but I reminded him of the potential risk in shouting or using the radio to bring more people blindly into this. I told him we'd turn back soon and report everything, but we needed a bit more information before we did. Suddenly, the rustling returned, louder this time, and we could see faint silhouettes moving between the trees, almost human in shape, but not quite right. They seemed to glide rather than step. I tried to get a better look, but they never stayed in one spot long enough. There was a moment when I swear I saw two pale eyes reflecting the dim light, but then they were gone, leaving only that unsettling silence behind. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, like the forest itself was warning me to leave. Tanner was shaking slightly, and I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold. We decided it was time to head back. Whatever these entities were, they didn't want us there, and pushing forward felt like a dangerous gamble. We retraced our steps, which was unnervingly difficult in the swirling fog. We stayed as quiet as possible, but a couple of times I heard soft whispers in the distance, vague, garbled phrases that almost sounded like pieces of conversation. Every now and then, I caught my name again. Or maybe it was just my imagination feeding off the stress. I honestly couldn't tell. When we finally returned to the trailhead, the fog started to lift, almost as if it had never been there. The sky was still grey, but the oppressive atmosphere started to dissipate. The other officers saw our faces and asked if we were okay. I told them we needed to restrict access to certain areas of the forest after dark and advised them to keep an eye out for anything unusual, no matter how small. I also recommended that they warn people not to shout or wander off alone, especially if they hear voices in the distance. I left Graford later that same day, still trying to make sense of what happened. I gave a quick debrief to the police chief, who seemed more open to my theories after seeing Tanner's shaken state. I reminded them all to stay vigilant, to not underestimate the power of fear and confusion in situations like this. I've dealt with rumored forest guardians or trickster entities in other states, but never had I witnessed such a potent blend of unnatural silence, sudden fog, and the precise mimicry of voices. Even now, months later, I can't definitively explain what I encountered in those woods. I think about the missing couple and wonder if those shadows or whatever lurks out there had something to do with their disappearance. The strangest part is how abruptly everything ended. Once we were out, it was as though the forest had swallowed its secrets back up. There were no more voices, no more rustling, just that lingering feeling that we were being watched the entire time. To this day, I can't fully wrap my head around it. I've studied plenty of strange phenomena in remote places, but something about Graford's forest left a deeper mark on me. It was quiet, horrifying, and impossible to prove. The fact that it all stopped so suddenly, leaving no solid evidence behind, still keeps me up some nights. And whenever I recall that voice calling my name, I get a shiver down my spine. I don't know what truly resides in those woods, but I'm certain it's nothing we've ever fully documented or understood. Story 13. I remember arriving at the farm late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the rows of dense trees. The sky was orange and pink, and it felt too calm for a place that was apparently terrorized by strange noises every night. I was welcomed by the family, 2 adults and a couple of teenagers. They looked worn out, like they hadn't slept well in days. We didn't waste time with small talk. I immediately started setting up my cameras and motion sensors around the property. The plan was to monitor everything from a small makeshift base inside the living room. I had a few monitors hooked up, and I could see my gear flickering from each corner of the yard. The farmland stretched beyond what any of my sensors could fully cover, so I focused on the areas most affected, around the barn and near the chicken coop. I also placed a small infrared camera facing the tree line, since that's where people said they had seen those tall, hunched figures lurking at night. Once it got dark, a heavy tension fell over the place. The family stayed in the house, trying to stay calm, but you could tell by the way they kept checking doors and windows that they expected something to happen. My heart was already racing, and all I had done so far was wait. Around midnight, the crickets and frogs formed this continuous background noise, almost comforting compared to the silence I'd been anticipating. But suddenly, right before 1 a.m., all the crickets seemed to quiet down at once. It was so eerie. I'd heard of forests going silent when predators appear, but this felt different, like the land itself was holding its breath. My first sensor alert went off near the barn. I looked at the monitor, but all I saw was a faint movement at the edge of the camera's range. It seemed big, but it was too dark to make out a shape. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously headed outside. The barn door was slightly ajar, but I was sure the farmer had shut it earlier. I went inside, and the animals, cows mostly, were stomping around, snorting in distress. I felt this strange smell, like something rotting mixed with wet earth. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, so I stepped back outside. That's when I noticed footprints in the dirt, but not like boots or hooves. They were shallow and kind of elongated, almost like someone's bare feet, except narrower and weirdly spaced. I took a few pictures, but they didn't come out too clear. The ground there was pretty packed, so the impressions were subtle. As I stood there snapping photos, I heard a rustling in the nearby bushes. I turned my flashlight, and for a split second, I thought I saw a tall, lanky form slip between the trees. It moved so fast it felt like a trick of the eyes, but every hair on my body stood up. It was like seeing a person who wasn't shaped quite right. By the time I got back into the house, the family could tell I was spooked. I tried to keep calm, but I was breathing fast, and they noticed. I looked at my monitors again, and one of the cameras caught a brief flicker of something, like a silhouette on the edge of the property. It disappeared almost instantly. I replayed the footage multiple times, but it was too blurry to confirm if it was a person, an animal, or something else. Then, around 2:15 a.m., the chickens started clucking and squawking like they were being attacked. I raced out with the farmer, keeping my flashlight pointed ahead. The coop door was rattling from the inside, but it wasn't locked. As we approached, everything went dead quiet again. No scuffling, no clucking. We swung the door open, and the chickens seemed fine, huddled in a corner, but they were freaked out, like they'd just seen a fox or a hawk. We couldn't find any signs of an actual break-in or anything, but the air had this coldness I couldn't explain. It was the middle of summer, yet my breath felt chilly. When we turned to go back, I heard this low moaning sound coming from the direction of the trees. It almost had a human tone, like someone in pain, but it was distorted and drawn out. I've heard coyotes yipping, I've heard owls screeching, but this was neither. The farmer and I froze. Then it stopped as abruptly as it started. We scanned the tree line with our flashlights, and for a split second, I thought I saw something pale just behind a trunk, tall and thin, kind of hunched. But when I looked again, it was gone. We decided to check the motion sensor cameras again. The monitor showed a lot of static for a minute or two, which is uncommon but not impossible out in the boonies. Once the static cleared, we saw a large, vague figure crossing the far edge of the camera's view. It was upright, but its movements looked unnatural, like a person trying to walk on stilts. The worst part was, at one point, it paused, as if it noticed the camera, then it vanished into the darkness. The entire house felt claustrophobic after that. The family kept quiet, listening for any more sounds. Suddenly, the teenage boy, who had been standing by the window, jumped back in terror. He claimed he heard someone whisper his name. We ran to the window, but no one was there. He was pale as a ghost, shaking. He swore he recognized his own name, but it was spoken in a voice that sounded off, almost electronic. All I could do was advise them to lock everything up. I felt powerless. There's no blueprint for dealing with whatever that was. I tried to stay awake the rest of the night, glancing at the monitors, but after 3:30 or so, nothing else happened. The recordings were mostly static or darkness. Even the animals had calmed down by then. It was like whatever was out there had lost interest, or maybe it had just done enough to scare us half to death. By dawn, I was exhausted. The family looked relieved to see daylight again, though nobody was truly at ease. I remember packing up my equipment with this heavy feeling of defeat. I had no real answers, only shaky footage, weird footprints, and that creepy moaning that didn't match any animal I'd ever heard. I tried to give the family some guidelines. Keep lights on, keep the animals locked safely, stay alert, call me if things escalated. But I was honest. I couldn't promise them any real solution. Before I left, I took a final walk around the property. The morning sun made everything look so ordinary, like a quiet, peaceful farm in the middle of Minnesota. It was almost impossible to reconcile that calm scene with the terror we'd felt just a few hours before. Even now, thinking back on it, I still get chills. I've investigated plenty of strange incidents, but something about those silhouettes and that twisted voice unsettles me to this day. It just stopped, like it was playing some sick game, and then left when it got bored. I don't have a better explanation, and it bothers me more than any other case I've worked on. I still wonder what really lurks in those woods, and if it ever decided to come back. Story 14. I still get goosebumps when I think about what happened that afternoon in the mountains near Eldersville. It was late in the summer of 2023, right before the evening chill set in, and I decided to take one last hike before dark. I'm not some daredevil who ignores warnings. I'd heard all the rumors about the strange creature that was supposedly part bear, part wolf, but I always assumed those were just local legends exaggerated over time. At worst, maybe it was a sick animal looking for food. I never expected anything truly bizarre. I parked my old SUV on a narrow dirt road leading into a lesser-known trail. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky with that deep orange glow you see in late summer. The air was crisp, a little cooler than it had been earlier in the week, so I threw on a light jacket and started walking. The trail was mostly quiet, except for the crunch of gravel and twigs under my boots. Occasionally, I could hear the distant call of a bird or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Everything felt almost serene for the first hour or so. As the sun got lower, the woods became eerily quiet. It's like all the birds decided to stop singing at once. I tried telling myself that it's normal for wildlife to wind down in the evening, but something felt off, like the forest was holding its breath. For a moment, I recalled the warnings people had been sharing, sightings of this strange, thin wolf-bear hybrid on 2 legs. It was all too ridiculous. Except now, alone with no one around, it felt a lot less ridiculous. I found myself scanning the edges of the trail, looking for any sign of movement. The undergrowth was dense, full of low bushes and tall grasses. Shadows stretched everywhere, blurring the lines between shapes. A fallen tree looked suspicious, but it turned out to be just a log. I started to feel uneasy, so I quickened my pace. My plan was to reach a small clearing about half a mile ahead, take a short break, and then head back. I kept checking my watch, hoping I'd make it there before the last light faded. Not long after, I heard this bizarre snapping sound, like thick branches breaking in quick succession. It echoed from somewhere off the path, maybe 50 yards into the trees. I froze in place, heart pounding in my chest. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. For a couple of seconds, I just stood there, debating if I should call out or stay silent. Common sense told me to remain quiet, so I did. But I couldn't help inching forward, curiosity battling my anxiety. Then I heard it again, a loud crack, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps, crunching dry leaves in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Whatever it wasn't small. A deer or mountain goat wouldn't make that much noise. My brain was screaming that this was stupid, that I should turn around and leave. But I kept telling myself, it's probably just a bear or a moose. Except moose aren't common around here, and black bears usually scurry off if they sense humans, unless they're starving or feel threatened. I moved behind a thick pine tree, trying to steady my breathing. It was hard to see anything through the dense canopy, but I caught a glimpse of movement. At first, I saw a large shape that I assumed might be a bear. It was big, but also not bulky like a typical bear. It seemed taller, with a leaner frame. The dim light made it hard to make out details, but I spotted pointed ears. My heart pounded so hard I worried it might hear me. Whatever it was, it stood on all fours for a moment, then rose onto 2 legs, and it stayed there, sniffing the air. My stomach dropped. I've seen bears stand on 2 legs briefly, but this thing's proportions were way off. It had a long snout, more wolf-like than bear-like, and its fur looked patchy or thin. The limbs were almost too long for a bear's typical structure. Everything about it felt wrong. I tried to stay absolutely still. My mind was racing with all the rumors I'd heard. Some described a diseased grizzly, others a giant wolf. A few older folks insisted it was a shapeshifter from old legends. Standing there, staring at this creature, none of those explanations felt comforting. The sense of dread was real. My palms were sweaty, even in the cooling air. Suddenly, it let out a low, guttural sound. Not exactly a growl, not exactly a whine, something in between. My breath caught in my throat. My entire body tensed. In a flash, the creature turned its head in my direction, and I'm convinced it locked eyes with me. I couldn't see its eye color from that distance, but I sensed it knew exactly where I was. Another soft sound escaped it, like an exhale through bared teeth. My only thought was, I need to get out of here. Slowly, I stepped backward, trying not to make any sudden noises or movements. The ground betrayed me. A dry twig snapped under my boot, echoing louder than a gunshot in the silent woods. The creature's head jerked up, and in 2 steps, it moved closer to the trail's edge. Its motion was unnervingly smooth and fast. There was nothing lumbering or clumsy about it. It was silent, graceful, like a predator. I felt my blood turn to ice. I wanted to bolt, but every survival instinct said running might trigger a chase, so I kept inching backward. Another step. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would burst. Then, for a split second, the creature seemed to hesitate, like it was considering whether to pursue me. Its posture was tense, shoulders raised, ears perked. I couldn't breathe. Then it slowly dropped onto all fours again, its gaze still fixed in my direction. Time felt like it stretched on forever. I could hear my own pulse and the faint rustle of leaves. After what felt like an eternity, it turned its head away, took a few steps deeper into the trees, and vanished behind the thick foliage. I stayed rooted to the spot, unable to believe what I'd just seen. My mind screamed at me to move, but my legs felt like lead. Eventually, adrenaline kicked in. I forced myself to speed walk, back down the trail. Every step felt like someone was watching me from the dark spaces between the trees. My ears were on high alert for any sign of it returning. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the brush made me jump. It was getting darker by the minute, which made the shadows loom even larger around me. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead, so I turned on my phone's flashlight. The beam felt pathetically small against the massive wall of trees around me. By the time I found the main path leading back to my SUV, I was practically in a full-blown panic. My hands shook as I rummaged for the keys in my pocket. I kept expecting that thing to lunge out from behind a tree. Finally, I managed to unlock the door, practically threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. I was breathing so hard, it took me a moment to steady my shaking hands enough to start the engine. I tore out of there, dust flying up in my rearview mirror. Even as I drove, I kept checking the side mirrors, half expecting to see that silhouette bounding behind me. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't let go. When I hit the main highway, I almost laughed from relief. But it was more like a shaky, terrified laugh that came from sheer nerves. I made it back home, locked every door and window, and just sat on my couch staring at the wall for what felt like hours. My brain refused to calm down. Images of that thing standing on two legs replayed on a loop. Rationally, I tried telling myself it was just a sick bear, but the shape, the way it moved, those pointed ears, nothing matched what I know about bears in this region. The next day, I tried talking to a friend about it, but I couldn't put into words how terrifying the experience had been. It's hard to describe something that you're still trying to make sense of yourself. I ended up just saying, I saw a strange animal, and left it at that. Deep down, though, I knew this was something else, something that doesn't fit the rules of the natural world as I understand them. For a while, I tried to keep an eye on local news or any new sightings. Strangely enough, nothing new popped up in the immediate days after my encounter. People still whispered about the rumored wolf-bear creature, but no one had a fresh story to tell. Maybe it moved on to a different patch of forest, or maybe it was just gone, as suddenly as it appeared. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw. I've replayed every possibility in my head, a deformed bear, a massive wolf with mange, or some unknown hybrid. But nothing quite fits. All I know is that for one heart-stopping moment in those woods, I came face to face with something that didn't belong in our everyday reality. And ever since then, I haven't looked at the tree line in Eldersville the same way. Sometimes late at night I catch myself thinking I hear that low, guttural noise just beyond my window. No one truly believes me when I try to give the details, so I mostly keep quiet now. But I'll never forget how time seemed to freeze and how my own fear nearly paralyzed me. Sometimes the simplest explanation is that there isn't one. And I guess that's how it ends. One weird encounter in the mountains that started and ended in a single day, leaving me with more questions than answers. I haven't gone back to that specific trail, and I'm not sure I ever will. Even now, just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. Story 15. I remember that day so vividly, like my mind refuses to let go of each second I spent near that river in Windlow. I'd heard whispers about this so-called Birdman for a few weeks. People kept talking about a creature with arms attached to its wings and burning red eyes. Honestly, I thought it was all nonsense at first. But then I found myself with a free afternoon, feeling a bit bored and way too curious for my own good. So I drove out to that dusty trail by the forest, near the bend of the river. It was late afternoon, the kind of time when the sun hits the tops of the trees in a weird angle, making the shadows stretch in strange shapes. I remember stepping out of my truck and noticing how quiet everything was, no usual birds chirping or even the rustle of small animals. It struck me as odd because normally that area is alive with wildlife. My gut was telling me something wasn't right. I started walking down a narrow path that led closer to the water. The ground was kind of muddy, and there was a strong smell of wet leaves. The silence felt heavier the deeper I went, and each step sounded way too loud in my own ears. After about 10 minutes, I reached a small clearing near the bank. There were stones lining the edge, and I could see the water flowing gently. At first, I just stood there listening, waiting to see if I'd catch any sign of something unusual. That's when I found the first feather. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Huge, about the length of my forearm, and pitch black. The edges were a bit frayed, and the shaft was thicker than you'd expect. It didn't look like something you'd see on a regular bird, not even a hawk or an eagle. I picked it up, and right as I was running my fingers along the quill, I heard this distant rustling of leaves. It almost sounded like someone big was moving through the branches above me. I looked up and saw, well, it was just a flicker of motion, high up in the canopy, gone before I could process it. But it was enough to give me a jolt of adrenaline. It definitely wasn't a squirrel or anything small. It was large, whatever it was. The branches swayed as though something heavy had just taken off. I felt a chill roll down my spine, but I couldn't see anything clearly. I stood there, scanning the tree line, my heart pounding. I tried to shrug it off and took a few more steps along the riverbank. That's when I noticed these weird marks on the trunks of several nearby trees. They looked like scratches but arranged in pairs, almost like big claw marks. Each groove was deep, and some of the bark had peeled away. I found 3 different trees with the same pattern. It reminded me of how a bear might mark a trunk, except these had a spacing that made no sense for a bear. I was starting to get nervous, not in the sense of a regular animal encounter, but something more primal, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd been there maybe 15-20 minutes when I heard it, the sound of wings flapping. But not the quick flutter of a regular bird. This was a slow, powerful whoosh, almost like you could feel the gust of air it created. I spun around, trying to locate it, but all I could catch was another dark blur above the treetops. The silence came back even heavier, broken only by the rush of the river. My mouth went dry, and I swear my heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I stood frozen, just listening. Then I heard this low, rumbling sound, almost like a deep whistle but distorted. It echoed through the trees, and my whole body tensed up. A part of me wanted to turn around and bolt back to my truck, but I was also weirdly drawn to figure out what was going on. The air felt electric, and every little hair on my arms was standing up. Suddenly, there was a crack, like a branch snapping under a heavy weight, somewhere to my left. I stumbled back a few steps, nearly losing my balance on the muddy ground. I looked in that direction, and through the gaps in the foliage, I caught a split-second view of something. It was tall, definitely over 6 feet, maybe closer to 7. The shape was crouched on a lower branch, partially hidden behind leaves. But I could clearly see these large black wings folded against its back, and arms that stretched out in a way that looked wrong, like they were part of the wings themselves. For a moment, I locked eyes with it, The eyes had this red glint, not glowing like a flashlight beam, but more like a reflection that pulsed. My stomach churned because it felt like it was looking right into me, not just at me. I couldn't breathe. My hands started shaking, and the feather I'd been holding dropped to the ground. I didn't dare move. I was too terrified it might lunge at me. Then, without warning, it launched upward. The branch shook violently as it took off. I was close enough to feel a rush of air and smell this weird, musty odor, almost like damp fur mixed with rotting leaves. I nearly fell backward from the force of it. My mind was screaming for me to get out of there, but my body was in pure shock. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually my instincts kicked in, and I started backtracking toward the trail. Every little sound or movement made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that thing to be hovering above me. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. The forest, which was already eerily quiet, now felt downright oppressive, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. When I finally made it back to my truck, I slammed the door and locked it without even thinking. I sat there for a few seconds, just trying to catch my breath and calm down. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I kept telling myself to drive, but I was too rattled to put the key in the ignition right away. My mind was replaying that image of the creature's red eyes and those wings, the way they seemed to fuse with its arms. Eventually, I managed to start the engine and pull away. I drove home in silence, half expecting to see a dark shape swoop down in my rearview mirror. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, and I realized I'd barely spent a couple of hours by the river, but it felt like a lifetime had passed. That evening, I couldn't focus on anything else. I just kept seeing the claw marks, the feather, and that crouched silhouette. I didn't call anyone or share it with my family, because I wasn't sure they'd believe me. Even now, I'm not entirely convinced of what I saw. Since then, I've thought about going back with better gear, or maybe with other people. Safety in numbers, right? But every time I picture stepping into those woods again, I feel this cold dread in my gut. It's not fear of a regular animal. It's something else, like a primal terror that I can't fully explain. And it's not like we have any solid evidence to prove it's more than just a local legend. I only have my own eyes and that terrifying moment when I felt truly helpless. I still have that feather, by the way. It's tucked away in an old shoebox under my bed. Sometimes I take it out and just stare at it, running my fingers along the edges. Part of me wonders if I imagined everything, if stress or my imagination got the better of me. But then I look at this massive feather and remember the weight of it in my hand. That alone is enough to remind me, I didn't make this up. I haven't returned to those woods by the river, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will. Whatever I saw, it was real enough to shake me to my core. Some people say it's just a giant bird. Others talk about some weird cryptid. I still have no idea. All I know is I was there. I heard those wings. I felt that presence. And I saw something that shouldn't exist. And to this day, I still don't have a good explanation. It just stopped, disappeared, almost like it never happened. But I know it did, and that's the worst part. Story 16. I still get chills thinking about that day in Elkwood Forest last summer. We'd planned 4 days of camping and fishing, just the three of us. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. No cell reception, no noise from the city, just the steady ripple of the lake and the crackle of campfires at night. The first day passed without a hitch. We set up our tents near the water, caught some fish, and enjoyed the quiet. But on the second morning, I noticed something off about the forest. It felt like the entire place was holding its breath. I remember getting up early that day because my friend wanted to fish at dawn. As I unzipped the tent, I realized how unnervingly silent it was. No buzzing insects, no chirping birds, just dead quiet. We shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was normal for that hour, and started trekking around for a good fishing spot. A few hours later, as the sun got higher, the forest seemed to come alive again with birdsong. We sort of forgot about that odd silence, busy with fishing rods and tackling lines. But it wouldn't stay forgotten for long. Around midday, the same hush descended. 1 minute, we were hearing cicadas and squirrels darting through the underbrush. The next, it was like someone switched off the volume. We paused, waiting for the sounds to pick back up. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this distant voice. It was faint but unmistakable, and it sounded like my sister calling my name. I turned to see if she was somehow behind me, which made no sense because she was 3 states away, but that voice was so clear I actually spun around thinking I'd see her. My 2 friends froze. One of them claimed the voice sounded like his dad, who'd passed away the previous year. The other one just looked terrified. The voices seemed to drift through the trees, urging us to move deeper into the woods. I can't fully explain it, but there was this weird pull, like if we just followed that sound, we'd find something waiting for us. One of my friends actually started walking toward the denser part of the forest. He only made it a few steps before I grabbed his shoulder and hissed at him to stop. The sun was beginning to set, and I wanted no part of investigating weird voices in the dark. He hesitated, but I could see he was tempted. There was something unnaturally familiar about those voices. It felt as if they were mimicking our loved ones perfectly, like whoever, or whatever, was making them knew exactly which voices would get our attention. We hurried back to the campsite, and for a moment, the natural sounds of the woods returned, albeit in a cautious way. You could hear crickets again, but they sounded uneven, like they were stuttering. We tried to act normal and started prepping dinner. We kept nervously joking about how maybe we were all just tired, maybe we were spooking ourselves, the forest was playing tricks on us. But we couldn't shake this growing dread. While we were roasting some fish over the fire, I saw a flash of white out of the corner of my eye, like something darting near the edge of the campsite. At first, I thought it might be a reflection from my flashlight, but then it moved in such a strange, fluid way, like it was half floating. One of my friends cried out, pointing in the same direction, so I knew I wasn't imagining it. But by the time we aimed our lights there, nothing. Just trees and shadows. We got up to check around, scanning the perimeter. All we found were some snapped twigs and unusual footprints we couldn't really make sense of. They weren't exactly human footprints, but they weren't paw prints either. More like elongated shapes in the dirt, almost like something walking on 2 legs, but leaving no distinct toe or heel marks. We retreated back to the fire, each of us silent, hearts pounding. After what felt like an hour, we started tossing around explanations. An albino deer, a reflection of the moon, or maybe just our imagination running wild. But I think we all knew something else was out there. It wasn't just an animal. The whole place felt predatory in a way I'd never experienced before, and I've gone camping countless times. Then came the loud snap from somewhere in the trees, a broken branch that echoed like a gunshot. We all jumped to our feet, shining our flashlights around frantically. The same hush fell over the forest again, and I swear it was even heavier this time. My gut told me not to shout, not to challenge whatever was there. One of my friends was clutching his flashlight like it was a weapon. Another friend whispered that we should pack up and leave right away, but it was already late, and the idea of stumbling through those woods in pitch-black darkness seemed more terrifying. That's when the voices started up again, even clearer. I heard my mom, who's very much alive in the real world, calling my name like she does when she wants me to come home for dinner. But hearing it in that dark forest, repeated in the same tone, twisted my stomach into knots. My friend heard his wife's voice. Another recognized his uncle's. We were all too freaked out to investigate. The hair on my arms was standing straight up, and my heart was thumping so hard it felt like it might leap out of my chest. We knew this wasn't anything natural, but it beckoned to us with a terrifying warmth. like it was trying to lull us into thinking it was safe. By then, we were sure we were dealing with something that could mimic voices, maybe to lure us away. I remembered reading about stories where creatures in the woods copy human voices to attract curious hikers. It always sounded far-fetched, but living through that moment, it didn't feel ridiculous at all. Every bone in my body told me we had to stay put and not give in. Eventually, the silence broke with a sudden scatter of half-hearted cricket chirps, but the tension never eased. We stayed glued around our campfire for hours, barely talking, eyes locked on the tree line. At some point, we decided to cram into one tent, 3 grown adults huddled together, too scared to sleep. I could hear every rustle outside, every breeze that made the branches creak. I lost track of time, but I'm sure none of us slept for more than a few minutes at a time, if that. When dawn finally crept in, we all emerged stiff and exhausted. The morning light felt almost surreal, like we were stepping out of a nightmare. But the weirdest part? The forest was back to normal. I heard woodpeckers drumming in the distance, the wind in the pines. If you just walked in right then, you'd never guess what the night had been like. We took one look at each other and silently agreed to pack up. We didn't even bother with breakfast. My hands were shaking while I stuffed my sleeping bag into its sack. None of us spoke much, but I could see the relief in their faces. Whatever it was, we all sensed it was gone, or at least not active in the daylight. The drive home was quiet. We stopped for coffee at a rundown gas station, and the first thing my friend said was, "What the hell did we just experience?" We exchanged theories, some supernatural, some trying to rationalize it as mass hysteria. But honestly, none of it fit perfectly. It's been months now, and I still can't explain how 3 people could hear voices mimicking loved ones who weren't there, or how an entire forest could go silent on command, or what that blur of white was, slithering around the edges of our campsite. We've only told a handful of people this story. Reactions usually range from disbelief to nervous laughter. Sometimes I wonder if maybe we imagined it all. But then I remember the footprints, that compelling urge to follow those voices deeper into the trees, and how we all experience the same eerie details. It's not something I can just brush off. That night changed the way I see the wilderness. I used to think of forests as peaceful and healing. Now I know there are corners of this world where something else, something we can't fully understand, might be watching. I haven't been back to Elkwood since. In fact, none of us have gone camping together since that trip. We haven't completely ruled out returning one day, maybe in a bigger group or a different season. But deep down, I'm scared of hearing those voices again, because if I do, I'm not sure I'll have the willpower to ignore them a second time. Even now, I can't say for sure what wanted us to come closer that night. I don't know if it meant us harm or if it was just testing us. Maybe it was a warning. But I do know that we walked away feeling like we'd been invited into something that we'll never fully comprehend. And just like it started, it ended. No grand finale, no violent confrontation, just an eerie silence that came and went, leaving 3 shaken people to pack up and leave at first light. I still get goosebumps replaying it in my mind, and I honestly don't think I'll ever forget that day in Elkwood Forest. Story 17. I've always been a big fan of late-night hikes. There's something about the stillness under the moonlight that has this calming effect on me, like the forest itself is letting me in on a secret. It used to help clear my head. But ever since that night in Black Creek County, Ohio, I can't set foot in the woods without feeling uneasy. It happened in 2022. I'd heard about this old road flanked by abandoned farms. People said it was scenic in a lonely sort of way. I figured it would be perfect for one of my night hikes. It was around 10 p.m. when I pulled up to this worn-out trailhead. There was no official parking lot or anything, just a patch of dirt where the grass was pressed down. It looked like it rarely got visitors. I remember stepping out of my car, breathing in the chilly air, and immediately feeling like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. The place was so quiet it made my ears ring. Even the usual nighttime chatter, crickets, distant frogs, was missing. It was odd, but I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just spooking myself before even starting. I grabbed my small flashlight and started along the trail. It wound through a thin line of trees, almost like a corridor leading into thicker woods. At first, I was more focused on the night sky than anything else. Despite the darkness, you could see a faint outline of old barns and collapsed fences on either side, reminding me that I was on someone's land once used for farming. After maybe 5 minutes of walking, that's when I got a whiff of something foul. It smelled like rotting fish, but sharper, almost like something decaying, but with this weird chemical edge to it. I've hiked in plenty of different places and have come across animal carcasses before, but this was so different, stronger, more nauseating. As I went further, the smell got worse. It felt like it was coming straight at me, not just drifting through the air. It was intense enough that it made my eyes water. I stopped and tried to listen, half expecting to hear some creature rustling around. I was worried I might find a dead deer or something. But there was nothing, no bugs, no birds, no distant coyote calls. It was unnervingly quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. Just to be safe, I called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" I have this habit of announcing myself in case other hikers are around. No one wants to scare or be scared in the dark woods. But I heard nothing back. A few seconds later, I caught this low, rumbling sound. It reminded me of a growl, but so soft and deep that I almost wondered if I'd imagined it. It came from a dark spot between the trees, just out of range of my flashlight. I shone the beam around, but all I could see were tree trunks and tangles of brush. The growl happened again. It wasn't loud, but it felt close, like it was right behind the trunk of one of those trees. I strained my ears, hoping to catch a glimpse of movement, but everything was still. And yet, the sound continued, a short, low rumble, almost like a warning. I've encountered raccoons and stray dogs on hikes before, but this felt different. It carried a weird heaviness that made my stomach churn. I decided to head back. I knew I should check if someone needed help, but at that point, my gut was screaming at me to go. So I turned around and started walking quickly back toward my car. That's when I heard the rustling. It sounded like someone walking on the same path, matching my pace but never getting closer. If I walked faster, the rustling sped up. When I stopped, it stopped. It felt like something was following me, copying my every move, just far enough back that I couldn't see it when I turned around. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The smell didn't fade either. It lingered, like it was clinging to my clothes or my skin. I tried to keep calm, but every time those footsteps got louder, I had this flash of panic. I'd spin around with my flashlight, but the path behind me was empty. I couldn't hear the growling anymore, but the footsteps never quit. Finally, I reached the edge of the woods, where my car was parked. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me a couple tries to get my keys out of my pocket. Once I was in the driver's seat, I immediately locked the doors. I felt a little safer, but my heart was still going a mile a minute. I turned on the headlights, aiming them at the trail entrance. Nothing moved. The trees were silent shadows, and that suffocating quiet was still there, except for the sound of my own breathing echoing in my ears. I was about to start the car when I realized I still smelled that horrible stench. It was weaker, but definitely not gone. I checked the rearview mirror, half convinced I'd see something behind me, but it was just darkness. No hint of glowing eyes, no silhouette, nothing. And yet, the hair on the back of my neck refused to settle down. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. In that moment, I felt this overwhelming urge to floor it out of there. So I did. I left that old road behind, seeing nothing in my mirrors but the faint outline of those abandoned farms. That smell didn't fully vanish until I was about 10 minutes away, driving with my windows cracked open to let the night air in. The next day, I told a couple of friends. I expected them to shrug it off, maybe tease me about my overactive imagination. Instead, one of them said they'd heard of weird stuff happening around Black Creek too. Strange growling noises, people sensing they were being followed, an awful smell, and just an overall feeling that something was watching them. Another friend suggested maybe it was a sick animal or some kind of sewage leak, but none of them could explain the footsteps that perfectly matched mine. No one had a solid answer for why the forest around there seemed dead, like even insects avoided it. I haven't been back since. Even writing this now, I can still remember the way my chest clenched when I realized something was trailing me, hidden just out of sight. I can't shake the memory of that deep, almost unnatural growl. What gets under my skin most is how it all stopped the moment I left, like it never happened in the first place, but at the same time, it definitely did. It felt personal, like I was trespassing somewhere I had no business being. I still do night hikes, but I stay far away from that old road in Black Creek. Sometimes I think about driving by during the day, maybe to see if I can find any logical explanation. But then I remember the way the smell clung to the air and the way the forest felt so completely devoid of life. It's like there's a part of me that knows I shouldn't pry any further. All I can say is that there's something off about that stretch of land. Maybe it's just rotting wildlife, or maybe there's some big animal nobody's identified, or maybe it's something else, something that watches from the shadows and doesn't appreciate uninvited visitors. I don't have any proof, just my own experience, but it was enough for me to stay away. To this day, I can't explain what I encountered or why it felt so malevolent. All I know is I've never felt a sense of dread like that before or since. Maybe I'll never figure it out, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Sometimes it's better to leave certain mysteries alone. Story 18. I still get goosebumps just thinking about that trip. It was supposed to be a relaxing family vacation in a small wooden house on a ranch near Marshfield, Wisconsin. I remember the place being so peaceful at first glance. There was a large lake out front and the forest all around us. My dad, who'd been on a few outdoorsy trips before, was really excited about fishing, hiking, and stargazing at night. It seemed like the perfect getaway. On our very first night, though, I noticed this weird silence that settled over the forest. It was eerie because it would happen out of nowhere. One minute we'd hear crickets, frogs, and leaves rustling in the wind, and then suddenly everything went dead quiet. No buzzing bugs, no croaking frogs, nothing. My dad mentioned he'd experienced something similar in other places, but somehow this felt different. It lasted too long, and it felt oppressive. I remember sitting on the porch, holding my breath without even realizing it, as if I were waiting for something to pounce out of the darkness. The second night we decided to make a campfire by the lake. We pulled out chairs, blankets, and hot chocolate. At first, it was a standard evening. My younger siblings were pointing at the stars, and I was joking with them about constellations. Then that hush fell again. I mean, I've been in quiet forests, but this was like nature hit a pause button. My mom glanced at my dad, and we all sort of looked at each other, feeling uneasy. Suddenly, we heard footsteps on dried branches, maybe 15 or 20 feet behind us. It wasn't the sound of a small animal scurrying. It was more like someone stepping carefully, trying not to be heard. We spun around with our flashlights, shining them into the trees, but no one was there. We looked at each other, kind of rattled, but we tried to laugh it off. My dad said it could have been a deer or something wandering around. But that weird quiet continued, and I could feel my nerves spiking. It's like the forest was holding its breath. The rest of that evening, I remember not even focusing on the fire or the stars. I just kept scanning the trees, waiting to see movement. Every now and then, a branch would snap, or I'd hear leaves crunch. But every time we aimed our lights in that direction, there was nothing. It felt like being watched, but not in the typical, maybe there's a bear kind of way. It was more unsettling, like there was an intelligence behind it. We eventually put out the fire earlier than planned, because all of us felt on edge. The next morning, I went with my older brother to check out the lake. We liked skipping stones and just hanging out there. Near the water's edge, we spotted footprints in the mud that neither of us could explain. They were elongated, but not quite human. My first thought was that maybe they were bear tracks with a weird shape, but the toe marks didn't match pictures I'd seen of bear paw prints. I remember noticing that they seemed to have a longer stride than I could manage, even on my tiptoes. We stared at them for a while, got spooked, and decided not to mention it to my younger siblings. We told my dad, though. He just frowned and said he wasn't sure what they were either. That same day, we tried to keep everyone busy with fishing and a short hike so we wouldn't dwell on the strange stuff. But throughout the afternoon, I kept feeling a tingling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching us from between the trees. Sometimes I'd snap my head around, convinced I'd catch a glimpse of some shape darting away. But I never saw anything concrete. It was more like flickers of movement in my peripheral vision. My heart would pound, I'd feel that rush of adrenaline, and then nothing. By the third day, we were all a bit tense. That morning, one of my younger siblings, only about 8 at the time, claimed to have seen something just outside the house window. They described it as a hunched figure in the bushes, something that moved too quickly when noticed. What freaked me out was the detail about its eyes reflecting light, almost like they had their own glow. My sibling was visibly shaken, and I believed them because they looked genuinely scared. The rest of us quickly ran outside with flashlights, but we found no footprints or broken branches near the window, just that creepy silence again. Dad started keeping one of those heavy-duty lanterns next to him at all times. Even when we were inside, if we heard the tiniest noise outside, he'd grab the lantern and peer through the windows. We never saw anything conclusive, just glimpses maybe. It was driving me nuts. It felt like the entire forest had turned into a stage for something unseen. And every so often, that hush fell again. It was the absolute worst feeling. Imagine being in a place known for its lively wilderness, and suddenly every living creature decides to zip it. It's almost like they were warning each other, or warning us. That night, we all agreed to stay indoors. We tried to watch a movie on a laptop we'd brought, but none of us could concentrate. I remember flinching at every tree branch scraping the side of the cabin. Even the wind sounded ominous. At one point, while I was getting a glass of water in the kitchen, I caught this movement outside through the window, just for a second. It was low to the ground, like an animal, but then it rose up taller than I expected. Then, in an instant, it vanished behind the shed. I froze, nearly dropping the glass. I wanted to check it out, but something inside me screamed not to go out there. The strangest part was that, after a few hours, everything seemed to go back to normal. The frogs started croaking, the cicadas buzzed, the wind rustled the trees again. It was as if the forest itself decided, "All right, we're done." The relief I felt was almost overwhelming. I could breathe normally again. We spent the rest of that night trying to pretend nothing had happened, but I barely slept, and I know my parents didn't sleep well either. We had a couple more days before we had to leave, but the sense of being watched never fully went away. My dad talked to the ranch owner about weird animal sightings, but the owner just shrugged and said they sometimes got wolves or coyotes. He claimed he'd never heard anything about a creature with glowing eyes, or about the forest becoming deathly silent for minutes at a time. Still, the owner looked uneasy, like maybe he suspected something but didn't want to scare us further. By the time we packed up and left, I was both relieved and oddly curious. Whatever was out there, it hadn't harmed us, at least not physically. But the psychological toll was heavy. For weeks after returning home, I'd jolt awake, imagining I heard footsteps outside my bedroom window. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that pitch-dark silhouette in the bushes, those reflective eyes glinting in the night. I've never really been able to explain it. Was it some rare animal? A trick of the light? I don't think so. There was something about those pauses in nature, as though the entire ecosystem recognized a presence and held its breath. And those footprints by the lake, that definitely wasn't a typical animal shape. It's been years since that trip, and my family still talks about it in hushed tones. We've even found a few other people who claim to have experienced strange silences and eerie sightings in parts of Marshfield. None of us have hard proof, just memories, a lingering sense of dread, and the certainty that we didn't imagine it. To this day, I get a chill recalling how the woods around that ranch would go quiet all at once, and how those phantom steps crunched the branches behind us when we were around the campfire. It all ended as suddenly as it started, like flipping a switch back to normal. The fact that we never got any solid explanation makes it even creepier. One moment we felt haunted, and the next we were just free to go. But that experience is etched into my mind, and whenever I think about returning to a similar place, I can't help but feel a stab of fear. I wish I had a neat conclusion, but I don't. It was there, and then it wasn't, and to this day, none of us can explain what happened. Story 19. I remember waking up that morning feeling a weird mix of excitement and dread. We were in Monterey Falls, Arkansas, a tiny rural village known for these bizarre lights people had been talking about. The place had an odd calm to it, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I could almost sense electricity in the air, even though it was just another humid summer morning. Our group of 4, myself included, had come from the university, determined to find something concrete to show the world. We had cameras, recorders, and enough caffeine to keep us wired for the long night ahead. By late afternoon, we had chosen a slight rise in the terrain that overlooked a patch of dense woods. We'd heard rumors that the lights often showed up near the tree line, so we figured we'd get a better view from that vantage point. Setting up the gear was both tedious and nerve-wracking. I kept glancing at the dark stretch of pines, expecting to see a flash or some movement. Every time a branch swayed or a bird fluttered, my heart jumped. It was silly, but something about that forest felt off, like it was watching us back. Around dusk, local farmers passed by and confirmed they'd heard whistling noises at night, sometimes close, sometimes echoing from deeper in the woods. They also mentioned footsteps, but whenever they tried to investigate, they found nothing. It was enough to send chills down my spine, but we were too curious to back out. We wanted that proof. We wanted answers. Night fell faster than we expected. The sky was clear, and the moon was just bright enough to bathe the treetops in an eerie glow. We positioned our cameras, 2 aimed at the woods, 1 facing the small clearing, and another in night vision mode, panning in slow arcs. Sitting next to our campfire, we stared into the darkness, feeling that pulse of anticipation. The surrounding forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves. We waited like that for hours, occasionally whispering to each other or checking the equipment. Then, not long after midnight, everything changed. At first, I caught it out of the corner of my eye, a tiny flicker of red between the tree trunks. It was so fast I almost doubted what I'd seen, but a few seconds later, it appeared again, a more defined glow that hovered about waist-high among the trees. I tapped my friend's shoulder and pointed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The glow vanished, then reappeared about 10 feet to the left. It moved in these short, sudden bursts, like it was deliberately staying out of focus. We scrambled to aim our cameras, but the second we pointed them in its direction, the light blinked out again. My friend nudged me to check the thermal imaging display, but it was blank. No heat signature, nothing. Just a cold, dark forest. By the time we looked up, that red glow had popped back into view, dancing further into the trees. It was like it was beckoning us. I felt a rush of cold fear, but also this overwhelming urge to see more. Stupidly, or maybe bravely, I don't know anymore. I took a few steps forward, shining my flashlight into the underbrush. The beam cut through the leaves, but the red glow jerked sideways, almost playful, staying just out of reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of our every move, like it was testing us. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and all I could think about was how I'd never experienced anything like this before. I could hear the others whispering behind me, but their words sounded distant. Then came the whistling. It started out faint, like wind slipping through a narrow gap, but quickly grew louder and more deliberate. One high-pitched tone, followed by a lower, drawn-out note. It repeated again and again, echoing off the trees. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't random. It felt like a pattern or a signal. I glanced back at the group, and no one was making a sound, so it definitely wasn't one of us. The whistling kept going, and the red light seemed to pulse in sync with it, bobbing up and down. It was downright unnerving. I kept expecting an animal to jump out, or for some local prankster to emerge, but no one came. Instead, the ground around me crackled, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, like something was moving just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I spun the light around but caught no silhouettes, no shapes. Still, that presence was there, heavy in the night air. I could almost feel eyes on me, but I had no idea from where. My camera was rolling, but glancing at the tiny screen, the red glow barely registered. It flickered like a glitch. Even though it was so vivid to my naked eye, the footage just showed a dim speck. One of my friends whispered that the thermal cam was still reading 0 heat. It made no sense. I took another step forward, slowly, trying to keep my breathing under control. The crunching sounds got louder, circling. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the whistling cut out. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath. I froze, expecting something terrible to lunge at me. That's when the glow flared brighter, almost like it was blinking. It darted behind a massive oak tree and vanished. I stood there, stunned. For a moment, I heard only the blood pounding in my ears. Then everything went quiet. No wind, no insects, absolutely nothing. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. My friends joined me, and we scanned the area with flashlights. We circled the tree where the glow had disappeared, but found no footprints, no broken branches, no heat signature, and no sign of anything. The only evidence was our own rattled nerves, and the faint sense that we'd just been toyed with. After a few minutes, we figured we'd try to keep filming in case the light returned. We hung around that clearing for what felt like hours, hoping we'd see the red orb again. Part of me wanted it to come back so we could get better footage, but another part of me was screaming to get out of there. My stomach was in knots. I've never felt so convinced that something intelligent and unseen was right in front of me. Eventually, we realized we were wasting our time. The lights were gone, and the forest fell back into its normal nighttime rhythm. Feeling defeated and on edge, we checked the recordings back at our campsite. As we feared, the cameras had captured almost nothing. You could see us reacting, our flashlights darting around, but the orb itself was only a faint flicker. My friend tried to enhance the clips on his laptop, adjusting contrast, brightness, everything. But all that showed was a blur, like a faint red smear, then blackness. It was beyond frustrating. What really got under my skin was the whistling. We had audio recorders running, but all we picked up was static during those moments. Before and after, we could hear the regular forest sounds, our whispers, but the moment the whistling started, the audio fizzled. It was almost like something was jamming our equipment. That realization made me feel sick to my stomach because it confirmed that whatever it was, it had some ability to mess with our gear. We sat up the rest of the night, half hoping for another appearance, but nothing else happened. Eventually, dawn began to break, and I felt a huge wave of relief, seeing the warm light spread across the horizon. The terror of the night before felt surreal, like it had been a bad dream. Except it wasn't a dream. We had the fuzzy footage to prove it, plus my racing heart. Later that morning, we packed up. No one said it outright, but I think we all felt that enough was enough. We'd come for answers, but we were leaving with even more questions. The local stories about orbs and whistling, the weird footsteps, it all fit with what we'd experienced, yet we had no real explanation. We'd checked for gas leaks, weird reflections, everything we could think of. Nothing lined up, and if it was a hoax, it was the most elaborate one I'd ever encountered. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that red glow weaving between the trees and the way the whistling echoed in my head. It felt like something was luring us deeper into the forest, toying with us. The fact that it ended so abruptly, like a switch flipped, makes it even more unsettling. One moment, the orb was right there, the whistling all around us, and the next, it was just gone. No explanation, no trace. I've shared our recordings and stories with friends and classmates. A few people think it was just some atmospheric anomaly or an animal's eyes reflecting light. But I know what I felt out there. It didn't move like any natural phenomenon I've ever seen, and it definitely didn't feel harmless. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was something beyond our understanding. All I know is that none of us have been the same since that night in Monterey Falls. Even now, when I think about it, I get that same tightness in my chest, the same prickling fear at the back of my neck. I don't have answers, just the memory of that haunting, flickering red orb and those impossible echoing whistles. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Story 20. I still remember the chill in the air that night, more than just the autumn breeze I was used to feeling in Shadow Creek. My friends and I, there were 5 of us, decided to head out to the woods by the lake, trying to capture something paranormal on film. It was this silly idea we got after hearing rumors about strange whistles and flickering lights out near the water. We had cameras, flashlights, and, honestly, zero real plan besides walking around and spooking ourselves for fun. Initially, it was all laughter. We joked about how we'd probably just find raccoons or maybe some deer. The trail started out wide and pretty clear, with the moonlight guiding us, but after about half an hour, the trees got thicker. It was like stepping into a different world, darker, colder, and way quieter. That was when the usual nighttime chirping stopped. No more crickets, no rustling in the bushes, just this unsettling silence that made my skin crawl. We continued anyway because, well, we were trying to act brave on camera. The idea was to record any weird noise and see if we could catch something interesting. At some point, maybe 15 minutes after we noticed the silence, we heard this whistle. It was faint, but super consistent, like someone was calling us. My first instinct was to laugh it off. Maybe it was just some random hiker messing around. But it didn't stop. It kept going in these short bursts, luring us forward. One of my friends pointed the flashlight in the direction of the sound, kind of flicking it a few times like a signal, but nothing answered back except the whistle itself. I could feel the tension rising in our group. It wasn't as funny anymore. Despite that, curiosity got the best of us, so we followed that sound to a small clearing. The weird part is, right when we got there, it went dead quiet again. I could literally hear my own breathing, and my heart was pounding. We stood there for a moment, panning our flashlights across the clearing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, the whistle picked up once more, now coming from behind a thicker patch of trees off to the side. It made my stomach drop, because it somehow felt intentional. We decided we had to check it out, so we moved closer as quietly as we could. That's when something ran past us, so fast I barely saw it, just a blur on the edge of my vision. I jumped back, almost dropping my flashlight. One of my friends cursed under his breath, and someone else squeaked out a half-terrified laugh, like they were trying to convince themselves it was nothing. We regrouped, shining our lights where we thought the figure had gone, but there was only darkness. A couple of us wanted to head back right then. My adrenaline was through the roof, but one friend insisted we keep going. Said we'd regret it if we didn't at least try to catch whatever it was on video. I didn't really want to, but I didn't want to be the only one chickening out either. So we kept walking, aiming for the lakeside. The trail wound down through the trees, and the deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. It was like the forest itself was watching us. At one point, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind us, but every time we stopped to listen, there was just silence again. After a few minutes, the whistle faded away, replaced by the soft sound of leaves rustling, which honestly felt worse. It was the feeling of being hunted, like something was there but only letting us hear it when it wanted. When we finally reached the edge of the lake, we noticed a faint glow reflecting off the water. It looked like a blinking light, coming from deeper in the forest on the other side. We thought maybe it was another group with a lantern or phone flashlight, but it had this odd rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. We stood there, shining our own lights around, trying to see if anyone else was there. No voices, no footsteps, no sign of people, just that dull, pulsing glow. That was the moment I realized my hands were shaking. I was holding the flashlight tight against my chest, and I could feel my heart thudding. There was something about that light that felt unnatural, like it shouldn't be there. One of my friends started filming again, trying to zoom in on the glow, but the camera wasn't picking it up well. Everything felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, and I couldn't stop the sense that we were being lured closer, like we were part of someone else's plan. We stood by the water for what felt like ages, but was probably only a few minutes debating what to do. No one was making jokes anymore. Eventually, we decided enough was enough. Whatever was happening, we didn't want to be part of it anymore. We turned around and started heading back the way we came, picking up our pace. We didn't talk much, just kept glancing over our shoulders, expecting that blur of movement again. After we'd gone maybe half a mile, we heard it, those footsteps behind us. Slow at first, then picking up speed. It was heavy, like a person's stride, but every time we turned around and pointed our flashlights, there was nothing but the unmoving trees. We'd go still, holding our breath, hearts racing, and the sounds would stop. The second we walked again, they picked right back up. It felt like some twisted game of tag where we never got to see who was chasing us. I was beyond freaked out by then and practically jogging. The others kept looking at me and each other, eyes wide, trying to keep everyone together. The whole forest felt darker than before, like the shadows were closing in around our flashlights. I remember tripping over a root because my legs were so stiff with fear. That's when we all just broke into a full sprint. It didn't matter if we looked stupid. We just wanted out of there. When we finally saw the trailhead markers near the entrance of the woods, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We stumbled out onto the main path, practically collapsing onto the dirt. The moment we left the cover of the trees, it was like some invisible barrier had been lifted. We could hear the wind, distant night sounds from the town, and our own frantic breathing echoing in the quiet. No more footsteps, no more whistling, no more glowing lights. It was just over. Later that night, we went back to one of my friend's houses to go through the footage. It was nerve-wracking to even replay the videos. You could clearly hear the whistle, especially in the quieter clips, and those footsteps that practically made my blood run cold every time they started up. But on the video itself, there wasn't much to see, just shaky shots of dark trees, patches of nothingness. The only odd visuals were brief flickers of movement in the background, like a shadow passing by, but it was too blurry to make anything out. I still can't explain it. Could it have been an animal? Maybe someone messing with us? But the footsteps sounded too deliberate, and that glow near the lake didn't behave like any flashlight I've ever seen. Plus, that whistle. It felt too directed, like it was meant for us. After that, I couldn't sleep well for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd replay the moment something sprinted past us in the dark. Some locals brushed it off when we told them, saying we probably scared ourselves into thinking random forest noises were supernatural. But a few other people mentioned hearing similar whistles at night near the lake, which only made me feel more uneasy. It's been a while now, and I still don't have any logical explanation. That night changed how I see Shadow Creek. It's no longer just a quiet little town in Vermont. It's a place where something can step out of the trees and vanish without a trace. I sometimes wonder if we gave it what it wanted. Our fear, our curiosity, our camera pointed into the dark. And the worst part is, after all this time, there's still no answer. It just stopped. Whatever was out there let us leave, and we never found out why. We never heard that whistle again, but I swear sometimes late at night I imagine I can feel it in the distance, calling me back to the lake. And that feeling, that lingering doubt, is something I haven't been able to shake off to this day.